The Alters is, quite possibly, one of the greatest games ever made in the uncommon and underrated genre of philosophical science fiction. Set on a distant planet under the constant threat of a scorching sun, a space exploration mission's only survivor, Jan Dolsky, resorts to cloning himself as both a means of escape and to secure the salvation of an Earth in crisis. In addition to a thoughtfully depicted space mission, The Alters presents challenging philosophical questions that are up to the player to decide, many of which come with the risk of jeopardizing the success of the entire mission, all set against the backdrop of an inhospitable planet harboring an invaluable natural resource and a limited amount of time that the mission can operate. But as with any highly detailed work in this genre, if you're as interested in science fiction as I am, you'll probably eventually find yourself asking, is this even realistic? Which is the question we are here to consider. And in this video, I'll be applying my experience from 3 engineering degrees and my time as an engineer helping build a commercial space station to the task of solving the game's practical problems, as well as entertaining some of its conundrums of philosophers, all in the interest of determining if the game can be considered realistic. Now in this review, our approach to realism will be slightly different from the way we usually approach it in the other reviews we've done so far. The basis for our realism analysis is still going to be a modification of the Kakelios principle based on the work of Dr. James Kakelios in his book The Physics of Superheroes. The version of his rule that we'll be applying to our science fiction settings states, as amended, that we will allow one miracle exception to the laws of physics for something to be considered realistic for every 500 years into the future it is set from our current time. This is an expansion beyond the allowance for only a single miracle exception, since the reasoning behind this rule is that major scientific developments that change our understanding of physics don't happen very often. However, if we were to go far enough into the future, we could suppose that more of these miracle exceptions were discovered that fundamentally change our understanding of the universe. Now, we are still going to consider miracle exceptions for our analysis of realism, but compared to some of the previous settings we've looked at, there are a lot more advanced technologies in the Alters that take some additional effort to explain, not all of which are easily explainable via a single or even several miracle exceptions. So instead of stating upfront which exception we will be considering throughout the review, we will keep a watchful eye out for anything that goes beyond our understandings of physics as we progress through the review. We'll be breaking up our investigation into 4 primary topics, starting with technology and engineering aspects of the game, before taking a look at the planetary science behind the inhospitable environment we find ourselves in. This will eventually lead us into a discussion of some of the theoretical physics that the game presents, from which we can transition nicely into a discussion of some of the philosophical topics that are central to the game's story. Now this leads into several other caveats that it's important to mention before we get started. I am doing this review prior to the game's DLC being released, which could potentially introduce some additional factors for us to consider, especially if the DLC ends up being what I think it will be. For now though, I'm also only going to be doing this review based on a single playthrough, which I will note you will not be able to experience everything the game has to offer in one single run, but if you're anything like me, you might find it difficult to replay the game to try to get a different ending, depending on the ending you end up getting the first time. Also, because this game has such a high dependency on player choice, your story will almost certainly be different than mine. And of course, the most important point before we start this review is that I will be avoiding spoilers at all costs, or at least to the greatest extent practicable. As such, I'm only going to be showing footage from the prologue and first act of the game, but we will be considering elements of the entire story thanks to some illuminating dialogue from our resident exposition device, Jan Scientist.
I choose to be deaf to your sarcasm.
The reason for this is that to a great extent, the story as well as some of the gameplay depends on the choices that you, the player, make, but to a much greater extent than you would typically see in choice-based games. Here, you don't get the standard good choice versus evil option, and instead, your own philosophy is the deciding factor to consider. And so, the game presents an excellent opportunity to test your own personal philosophy in the challenging situations you'll find yourself in. Furthermore, with choice being such a major focus of the story, and there being so many philosophical decisions to make, this game also probably contains the greatest number of life lessons I've ever encountered in a single piece of fictional media. And I've seen a ton of movies. Even if it means this video doesn't necessarily perform very well, I would much rather you play this game for yourself first, since, and I don't say this lightly, The Alters seems like a rare piece of media with the potential to make one a better person for having experienced it. Is that perhaps a bit of an over-exaggeration? Well, you'll have to play the game for yourself to find out. So with all that said, I will strongly recommend you play this game yourself first before watching the rest of this video, as I would hate to deprive you of the opportunity to experience what this game has to offer. Or if you're not fully convinced yet, I would definitely understand if at any point in this video you feel like going to play the game yourself before coming back to our investigation of whether or not the game is realistic. So here's your last chance to go play the game yourself first before we get started with our review. The primary driver between Ally Corp's space exploration mission is the elusive time-traveling substance Rapidium. This substance emits a particular form of radiation which, when absorbed by biological cells, can result in the aging of the organism by years within the span of hours. As a result of an unspecified crisis on Earth, the promise of accelerated plant growth by means of Rapidium is pitched by Ally Corp as a potential solution to world hunger. The only problem with this plan to save the world is that before the events of the game, only 1 or 2 samples of Rapidium have ever been identified. As a result, there has been very little research into this potentially world-changing new element. So, Ally Corp has sent out exploration vessels to seek out new sources of Rapidium and report back the locations of systems for further mining operations to take place. Now, first things first, there does appear to be some inconsistency in the number of times that Rapidium has been detected and studied prior to the events of the game. The in-game data log about Rapidium reports that it was first discovered accidentally on the asteroid 842 Hermes as the asteroid was passing Earth. By the asteroid naming convention, the number preceding the name indicates the body's number, which is used to keep track of the total number of asteroids discovered, which is actually well above 842 by this point. And in fact, asteroid number 842 was discovered in 1916, and while the origin of its name has been lost, it is now referred to as 842 Kirsten. Perhaps because of the unknown origin of this name, the asteroid was eventually renamed to Hermes, but personally that seems like too cool of a name to give to a random asteroid. Separately from this instance, later on in the game, it is reported that the only sample ever observed in space was studied aboard a CEBA base similar to the one we see in-game, at a very great distance away from Earth. Now, perhaps this inconsistency could be attributed to verbiage, in that the initial discovery of Rapidium on 842 Hermes could have simply detected the presence of Rapidium by its radiation signature, perhaps followed by additional observations of the asteroid to collect more data, and determine additional properties of the substance. The deep space observation of Rapidium, then, probably occurred on an early Ally Corp exploration mission during the ensuing search for the substance. Or perhaps it could also have been accidental if Ally Corp already had deep space spacecraft out in that area. This is a rather minor point, but I figured it deserves some attention just because it was a little confusing to me at first. So with that minor detail out of the way, we can discuss some of the more interesting aspects of Rapidium. Rather than providing a definitive time-traveling mechanism, the rapid aging caused by exposure to Rapidium radiation is effectively the result of overdriving the mitochondria within the cells of the organism affected by the radiation. Now this gets into biochemistry, which is very much outside my field of expertise, so I'll explain this at the basic level that I understand it, but I would definitely defer to an actual biochemist to explain this in more detail. At a very basic level, mitochondria are responsible for the production of adenosine triphosphate, which again at a very basic level is used to provide energy to other cells throughout the organism. The implication here then would be that through some unknown mechanism, the radiation produced by Rapidium, once absorbed by some element of the mitochondria, enables the breakdown of glucose into adenosine triphosphate at a much more rapid pace than would typically take place. They're found in both plant and animal cells, so the use of Rapidium to grow plants faster at least checks out in that regard. The implied result of this, then, is that aging of the organism goes by much faster. Now, it's probably not far off to assume that there could be other negative physiological effects of this rapid aging process, particularly in more complex organisms like humans and sheep. This concept appears to be based on the mitochondrial theory of aging, but at this point we're getting a little too far for me to be able to speak authoritatively on this subject. Now, since accelerated biological aging is the primary outcome desired from exposure to Rapidium radiation, we can briefly consider the radiative properties of Rapidium and what sorts of radiation we might be expected to encounter. In-game, Rapidium is described multiple times as an element, meaning that its atomic nucleus has a particular number of protons, which confer on it particular chemical properties. Now, depending on your familiarity with the periodic table of elements, you are probably already aware that higher atomic numbers of elements are very unstable and quickly transmute into other lower elements through radioactive decay. It should also be noted that the highest atomic numbers are synthetic elements, which do not occur naturally and have only been observed in laboratory settings. Thus, if Rapidium were to be a high atomic number element, we would have to overcome the challenges of rapid radioactive decay, as well as it presumably not existing in nature. Now, the first of these challenges is not necessarily totally impossible to overcome, since according to some models, it is predicted that at some point along the periodic table, as the element number increases, we might eventually encounter what is known as an island of stability, or perhaps alternatively an island of inversion, where atoms might once again have a significant amount of time that they can survive before experiencing radioactive decay. There's also a potential theorized continent of stability consisting of up-down quark matter, but that would require a detour into high-energy quantum chromodynamics, which is not the point right now, and to say the least is probably not what we're dealing with in the case of Rapidium. Rather, we can assume that wherever Rapidium would wind up on the periodic table of elements, the particular arrangement of protons and neutrons in the atomic nucleus is somehow sufficient to prevent spontaneous radioactive decay. Now, this still leaves us with the challenge of high atomic number elements only occurring in laboratory settings as a result of high-energy particle experiments. In at least some cases, these high atomic number elements are produced by bombardment of atomic nuclei by particles, such as protons or alpha particles, which are helium nuclei. These interactions can lead to nuclear fusion, resulting in a larger atom being formed, which potentially contains more protons than it started with, resulting in a higher atomic number element. With this in mind, we could perhaps suppose that the formation of Rapidium is driven by bombardment of naturally occurring high atomic number elements by significant levels of alpha and beta radiation, eventually resulting in extensive enough nuclear fusion reactions that Rapidium is formed. Now, considering that many previously discovered synthetic elements of high atomic numbers have extremely short half-lives, if you wanted to produce a higher atomic number by means of particle bombardment, you would probably need to have a significant level of radiation to ensure that you get enough particles to actually irradiate the substance in question, because it would otherwise probably decay back down to a lower number element much faster than the rate of nuclear fusion reactions could keep up with. As a result, we could then infer that Rapidium would have to be extremely rare, since the conditions for its formation would require significant levels of radiation. However, we are told in-game that the existence of Rapidium is considered to be more likely in the presence of triple star systems. Were a planet to be discovered within such a star system, and the stars were particularly active, it could then be assumed that the planet receives such a significant level of radiation of alpha and beta particles that elements within its crust could potentially react to eventually form Rapidium. Little wonder then that this substance is so rare, considering that it has such particular requirements for it to exist in the first place. Now, while we can potentially explain how Rapidium could exist in the first place, we do have to assume that our current understanding of physics can be extended with the inclusion of a definitive island of stability, as well as the potentially less challenging aspect of a highly irradiated planet within a triple star system. Thus, for the purposes of this review, we can probably say that Rapidium does still require a miracle exception, both to explain its existence as a high atomic number element, as well as the particular type of radiation that it is capable of emitting, which is able to supercharge cellular mitochondria. At the very least, though, we can at least say that the mechanisms by which Rapidium is operating do seem to have at least some basis in real physics. One important piece of technology we don't actually see in the game, but is essential for setting up the premise of the game, is the quantum navigation system. This is essentially an autopilot for the exploration spacecraft. The system takes in significant amounts of data that it uses to determine probabilities of encountering the valuable Rapidium at various possible destinations. Once the system identifies a likely target, the ship's trajectory is adjusted accordingly. This is apparently done while the crew is in cryosleep, although at least mission control is notified. As a result, upon arrival, the crew will awake from cryosleep without necessarily knowing where they're actually located. This could potentially be a means of protecting classified information from being leaked to the public if Ally Corp had significant deep space exploration competition somehow. It is also implied later on in the game that this technology is capable of traveling many light years away from Earth, which would imply the use of a faster-than-light propulsion system. As I'm sure you're aware by now if you've watched any of my previous reviews, usually if we don't have any other constraints, we can use the Alcubierre warp drive as our faster-than-light propulsion system, which, while still not technically possible with currently understood physics, is at least the most feasible option so far. The use of cryogenic suspended animation technology is also something that is not currently possible with existing technology today, and so the quantum navigation as a whole will require us to expend 2 miracle exceptions. Aside from our spacesuit, the first piece of technology we encounter is the drop pod, a small single-person craft designed for controlled landing. This capsule appears to be designed to undergo atmospheric entry, protecting itself by a heat shield, before slowing and stabilizing its descent using propulsive thrusters, and eventually slowing itself down to a safe velocity through the use of parachutes. Now, it's not specifically stated that this design is intended for deployment from space, and it could be possible that these are deployed after a mothership has already entered the atmosphere, reducing the burden of aerothermal heating that the capsules would need to survive. This would be particularly important for the full glass window on the front of the capsule, which also apparently doubles as a backup monitor for the onboard computer. During re-entry, the capsule would be ensheathed in high-temperature plasmas, and in addition to sustaining high temperatures, the glass here would most likely have to be opaque to infrared light to avoid cooking the occupant from radiative heat transfer. It does appear that the front window has two lever mechanisms by which the window can hinge out upon landing to allow the occupant to easily exit the craft. However, there also appears to be a hatch on the upper surface of the vehicle, complete with handrails and redundant ladders to allow them to exit the craft safely in the event that the front window is blocked. Here it appears that the front window has shattered, although this could perhaps also be an emergency means of escape in the event that the mechanism is not capable of opening the window. At the base of the vehicle, we can see that it has what appear to be inflatable floats to allow it to perform a safe water landing, or with its more technical term, splashdown. This has been done historically for most human-capable spacecraft that re-enter the atmosphere and land back on Earth, with the obvious exception being the Space Shuttle, as well as the Soyuz and Shenzhou capsules, and technically the New Shepard. Oh yeah, and Starliner, that's a thing too. The most obvious potential challenge to this is the possibility of the capsule sinking, which did actually happen at one point during the Apollo program, fortunately without the casualty of astronaut Gus Grissom. This could potentially be even more of a concern for a splashdown on an alien planet without support infrastructure available to help assist the astronaut after landing. To alleviate this possibility, you would probably want to make sure that there are redundant flotation devices available, such that if some of them fail to inflate, the rest of them are still able to provide enough buoyancy to keep the craft above the water. The other potential challenge for a drop pod designed exclusively for water landings would be the necessity of landing in water. If the planet that you're landing on does not have oceans, this may be difficult, and particularly in inclement weather, such as we see in-game, it may be excessively difficult to steer the craft into water to avoid a hard landing for which it is not designed. Now, whether or not an improper landing is actually the true cause of death for this crew could technically be considered a spoiler, so I'll let you play the game and figure that part out for yourself. In addition to the human-rated drop pods, we also see that there are several cargo capsules that are also delivered to the planet in support of the mission. These share a mostly similar design, but of course with the absence of a human crew member, the design of these capsules is much simpler. In the absence of a flotation device, it would appear that the capsules are intended to touch down on land, which would make them easier to recover for the crew, and since there's no humans on board, the total deceleration required to allow the capsule to land safely would presumably not be as significant. Instead, you need to make sure that all the cargo on board can survive the prescribed G-forces, at least for a nominal landing profile. One of the most unique technological designs we see throughout the game is that of the mobile base. Perhaps only reminiscent of Grievous's wheel bike, this is a very unique approach to the design of a mobile, reconfigurable base for planetary surface operations. Outside of that though, the two most immediate concerns with this design would be how to steer it and how to keep it from falling over. The first of these problems is relatively easy to resolve. On the outer surface of the base ring, we can see that there are actually two drive surfaces, which presumably would be capable of rotating independently. This essentially then means that the base has two wheels with which it can steer itself, allowing steering to be performed more simply than with a single wheel. The bigger challenge is probably how to keep this thing upright. This is probably best approached by the use of reaction wheels. Instead of being used to drive along a surface, these machines are essentially designed to produce angular momentum about their axis of rotation. The application of a torque from a motor to turn the mass of the reaction wheel effectively produces a counter-torque on the fixed portion of the system. This counter-torque could then be used to counteract the angular motion of the base tipping in one direction by balancing out the total angular moments of the base. While reaction wheels are typically used in spacecraft, they can also be used for robotic balancing acts here on Earth, such as in the somewhat classic control systems project of a self-balancing stick. Now, if a massive object the size of the base were to start tipping, you would probably need quite a bit of angular momentum to balance it back upright. And so if you were to use a single reaction wheel to accomplish this, it would probably need to be quite massive and or quite a large radius, neither of which is very conducive for fitting onto an already large space vehicle. However, you could still potentially balance out the angular momentum with a larger number of small reaction wheels, each of which would contribute a portion of the total angular momentum required. This would also provide redundancy in the event of a failure of a single reaction wheel. In any case, the total torque capacity of the reaction wheels would determine to an extent the total amount of mass that the base can hold and keep upright as a function of the base's center of mass, which would be a function of the total mass of all the modules, and in particular their elevation above ground level. In addition to other factors, which we will discuss shortly, this could be part of the reason why an expansion to the base ring is needed to house additional modules, since it wouldn't be capable of balancing itself if too much mass was added. And the smaller multiple reaction wheels are housed within the outer ring of the base. On this point, we can note that the outer rim of the base is expandable with the inclusion of additional ring segments. To avoid having to build completely new segments every time the base is expanded, this could perhaps be made more feasible if the individual ring segments use more compliant materials than a completely rigid structure. This would presumably tread a very fine line between being insufficient to hold itself together and flexible enough to actually conform to the new shape of the ring. You would also need to make sure that the operation of any mechanisms on board the ring are not affected by the new orientation. On a somewhat related topic, we can investigate the drive and engine system of the base as well as its fuel source. The latter is more obviously visible in a fuel module that we can see from the exterior of the base. In-game, the base uses organics as its fuel supply, which we could interpret as hydrocarbon chemical compounds. As the name implies, these are chemical compounds containing both hydrogen and oxygen, and in this case could refer to compounds such as octane, or other similar compounds that would combust readily in the presence of oxygen. Now, if this reaction were being implemented with an internal combustion engine, and it were using air intake, you would need to operate within an atmosphere that contains oxygen. Alternatively, if the base drive system were to use electric power, then alternative chemical reaction processes, such as in a fuel cell, could be used to extract electrical power from the chemical reactants, with the oxygen being supplied from either the atmosphere or from onboard storage. And in this case, an electrical generator using internal combustion could still be possible as well. This also brings up an interesting point about the drive mechanism for the base wheels. In many modern wheel-based drive systems we see on Earth today, the rotation of the wheels is typically driven by a rotating power source. However, for the CEBA Base that we see in-game, we don't actually see any sort of input drive gear that might turn the inside of the wheel. As with our reaction wheel analysis, we could perhaps say that a large number of small gears are used to drive a large outer gear, but perhaps a simpler solution could be that the wheel is driven by means of a linear motor. This is essentially the same electromagnetic process used in a rotational motor, except that the circular arrangement of magnets within the rotational motor is essentially unwound and laid out flat in a linear fashion. These motors are sometimes used in maglev trains, for example. With this approach, the base drive system could use a mostly linear motor laid out along the circumference of the base, providing a continuous drive surface for the outer wheels. The end result of this is effectively an inverted rotational motor, with the rotor being placed on the outside of the stator, with individual segments of the base ring being characterized as having linear motors. We would also need 2 tracks of linear motor magnets to accommodate both wheel drive surfaces, as we previously discussed. Also along the outer ring, we see a mobile T-Rex arm, as it's titled in-game, which provides access to base modules via an elevator. This arm apparently rotates along an inner track of the inside of the ring and uses a combination of 3 rotational joints and apparently 1 linear actuator to bring the elevator module up from the ground level up to an accessibility point on any of the modules. As far as accessibility goes, this is a rather clever way of actually being able to access the base itself from the ground level without the need for additional deployable structures to support the base. However, this also means that if the T-Rex arm stops working, then getting into or out of the base would become rather difficult. Lastly, we can briefly note that the modular design of the base allows it to be much more versatile and well suited for various different types of space exploration missions. As is implied by the base's condition when we initially encounter it, the base could be outfitted with only the basics to keep a crew alive, and then could be outfitted with additional modules specific to the mission as the mission progresses, reducing complexity and launch mass of the base to begin with. This does bring up the point of the mechanism by which the base is actually able to be reconfigured, and by which additional modules are manufactured to fit into the base itself. We could perhaps suppose that the T-Rex arm is partially responsible for the placement of modules, but the manufacturability of the modules in a timely fashion is probably going to be more difficult to explain. Now, we could say that the manufacturing of additional modules, as well as the general reconfigurability of modules within the base, is mostly included as just a gameplay element, but I suppose if we wanted to be a little bit more far out, we could say that this is accomplished through some means of self-assembling materials and some advanced implementation of programmable matter and nanotechnology, which often tends to be used as a sort of magic system in science fiction, so we'll try not to rely on that too heavily. But in this case, this could perhaps be a good explanation for how these modules are able to be manufactured without an additional facility on planet to manufacture them. The design and functionality of each of the base's individual modules are so varied and detailed that we'll discuss each of them in their own segments. Since there must be some controlled manner in which to exit and enter the base, the airlock is probably one of the most important modules. Based on its appearance, though, we could probably say this is better described as a ready room to prepare for EVA operations, more so than providing the actual functionality of an airlock. While the game's camera perspective only allows us to see 3 sides of the module, we can presume that the 4th side is the location of the doorway, which is accessed by the elevator module. This elevator then is probably more likely where the pressure equalization takes place. It would also be a smaller volume that would need to be equalized as well, making it more conducive for this purpose. Inside the base module airlock, we can see that the cable management could use some work, but this is probably forgivable given the circumstances. The loose storage on the 4th wall would be convenient for stowing items before and after exiting the elevator, and items could perhaps be secured by strapping them down to the perforated shelves. One of the containers we see on these shelves is marked as medical kit, which is of course important to have in an area where you're going to be traveling outside the base, and to have readily available upon re-entering. The module also contains a prominent window, which would allow operators to see what the environment is like outside before exiting. I suppose we can't say conclusively that none of the other modules don't have windows on their 4th walls, but from the exterior views it appears that these modules would then be covered up or possess one-way transparency. The larger storage areas towards the back of the module house various items that we can presume to be the gear that we get to use in the game. These being the scanning telemetry spikes, the jackhammer, suit batteries, and the suits themselves along with their exoskeleton units. Notably, there only appears to be storage space for 2 spacesuits, whereas we can see throughout the game that it is possible to have more than 2 people exiting the base simultaneously. We could perhaps say that there is perhaps some storage space on the 4th wall of the module, or perhaps that these spacesuits are capable of being stored elsewhere in the base when not in use. We can also see a number of small totes that could perhaps be used for storing samples from the exterior, or just for carrying around smaller gear like lots of batteries all at once. The deployment arm for the computerized display is at least convenient for being able to move the display out of the way when it's not needed, and to be fair, frees up space on the walls that now don't need to have the screen mounted on them. But this solution does seem a tad over-engineered, since you probably could just as easily have implemented a transparent display over the window, for example. There's also the matter of making sure that the screen is still accessible in the event that the robotic arm fails somehow, but this could perhaps be accomplished by having the robotic arm configured in such a way that when they're depowered, the screen is lowered to an accessible position. We can also see that this module clearly indicates where the primary translation paths are on the floor, where you would primarily be walking when going between modules, as well as having a sort of grading system such that any liquids could drain off the suit upon entry back into the base. This walkway also appears to be modular in some sense as well, and for the most part still remains free of tripping hazards. By modern spacecraft standards, and even by American apartment standards, the captain's cabin is quite spacious for a single person to occupy. Interestingly, upon arrival, the captain's cabin is also the only crew quarters present in the base, as it was constructed upon landing. The floor plan is nice and spacious enough for a single person to do some exercise and to be able to pace around some. They also have a pretty large gaming computer desk, although it doesn't appear to have a keyboard and mouse, so you probably would end up needing a controller for most modern games. This computer is used to access the dossier of information that we come across throughout the game, but interestingly, apparently cannot be used to actually pilot the base to another location, which has to be done done from the command center. Networking-wise, it's probably easy enough to interlink the two modules together to allow the captain to control the base from their cabin, and so this is probably just a gameplay element. At the side of the desk, there is what appears to be a holographic table, or at the very least a glass-topped one. This could perhaps be used to display holographic information about the terrain in which the base is located, which could be used to inform decisions on EVA operations or for route planning considerations. The captain's chair is also on a slider here so that they can move between the desk and the holographic table more easily, which is a pretty clever solution considering that the chair would remain attached to the base when it's moving, but also means it might be tricky to actually adjust your location if you're not perfectly comfortable with the spacing between the chair and the desk. The captain's bed has a pronounced curvature at the base of the headrest, which personally seems like it would be rather uncomfortable, but that's just my preference. The foot of the bed appears to have a TV built into a frame over the top of it, behind which there appears to be a space for hanging clothes. A clever way of saving space in this area. The sleeping quarters also features a full wall screen that presumably can be programmed to show any image the captain prefers. From a reverse image search, this one appears to be the Matterhorn in the Swiss Alps. Programming in some more pleasant scenery would definitely be helpful for reducing stress at the end of a long day, in particular when you're about to fall asleep, when you would preferably be in a very low stress state. Given its placement in the module, it's also possible that this could double as a window when the screen is disabled. Under the bed, we can also see a cleaning robot. This is particularly important here as the walkway in this module features a carpet. While air purification is definitely a possibility in this setting, the limited availability of medical treatment options means that even any slight measures that can be taken to reduce the likelihood of sickness or allergies, such as by reducing the total amount of loose dust in the base, would be beneficial for ensuring crew health. On that note, we can also see what appears to be a bladeless fan in the corner of the module, which is apparently connected by a power cord to the ceiling of the module. Since the ceiling is probably too high to reach without a stepladder of some kind, this is somewhat inconvenient for having to actually access the power systems if they're all located on the ceiling. The fan is a nice inclusion though, as even though we're in the presence of gravity and we don't have to worry about CO2 buildup, it is still nice to be able to have some air circulation so that the air doesn't get too stale. This would also provide a backup for any air conditioning system that is reused throughout the rest of the base. We can also note that the captain's bed area appears to have a directional light on it that is most of the time displaying blue light. This would be helpful for maintaining a more Earth-like circadian rhythm on a 24-hour sleep-wake cycle, if the blue light is shown in the morning when you're first waking up and throughout the day. When it's time to go to sleep though, it'd be more beneficial for this light to change color to a warmer light such as the one we see over the desk. This is because warmer and more orange lights are more typically associated with evening times and in particular the color of the sunset, making it more conducive in helping your body prepare to go to sleep. Based on some of the information we learned throughout the game, the rather unassuming communications room is probably one of the more technologically advanced modules of the base. On the surface, it appears to be a rather basic video conferencing room with frosted glass privacy doors of questionable usefulness. Outside, perhaps sound muffling. However, once the video conferencing technology is active, we can see that this system is able to establish near real-time communication with Earth. Now, while we have not specifically established where in the universe this planet is located in relation to Earth, it is worth noting that optical communications with the moon are delayed by up to several seconds, since light takes approximately 1.5 seconds to reach the moon. As such, with existing radio communications technology, we would need to be closer to Earth than the moon is in order for communications to be possible at near real time. Thus, the fact that we are able to accomplish near real-time communication from an unknown distance away from Earth implies that the base possesses some form of faster-than-light communication system. Now, oftentimes in science fiction, this is accomplished through some form of subspace communication system derived from Star Trek. However, in this setting, we also have available to us the presence of the quantum computing technology. Now, in current understandings of quantum physics, it seems to be the general consensus that quantum information may be able to be transmitted faster than light, but classical information not so easily. Again, keeping in mind that I am an engineer and not a quantum physicist, while the possibility of faster-than-light communication using quantum entanglement is generally considered to be impossible, we are still working in highly theoretical territory here. And indeed, in recent years, quantum computing has advanced very rapidly. On a purely qualitative level as well, oftentimes the reason I see that faster-than-light communication is posed as not being possible is simply because, well, it would violate classical physics. This is obviously a very surface level remark, and I will freely admit that I do not understand all the mathematical implications and requirements of quantum mechanical operations, but I think it's fair to say that given that we do not have a consistent, unified theory of quantum physics at the current time of recording at least, there is still the possibility that future discoveries might affect our understanding of physics as a whole, perhaps in ways that could eventually be implemented by computer engineers to allow some sort of communication system that could operate faster than light, using quantum entanglement as its basis. This then would imply a miracle exception, according to our earlier definition, although this one has its roots in the gray area of existing physics, more so than an outright violation of what is currently understood to be possible. Again, I'm an engineer and concerned more about the implementation of physics rather than the determination of it in the first place, so you're welcome to correct me on this subject. The overall point of this is that while we probably do still need a miracle exception to explain this faster than light communication system, it is perhaps at least a less severe exception to physics compared to some of the other stuff we've been talking about. Assuming then that we do have some means of transmitting classical information across great distances faster than the speed of light, it does seem that we have a rather limited amount of data that can be transferred using this system. On the one hand, the voice data seems to be transmitted quite effectively, once the base is fully operational at least, but at one point there is also a brief mention of visual telemetry being transmitted from the planet back to Earth. Ironically, this is not using the video conferencing room, which perhaps suffered some sort of graphical processing malfunction during the crash. Now, this could perhaps be referring to a space telescope that is able to view the planet from a greater distance than an orbital spacecraft of some sort, perhaps the one that delivered the base to this planet in the first place. But again, this suffers the challenge of real-time visibility of the planet's surface, which in the case of a space telescope would be limited by the speed of light. In any case, this does seem to imply that there is a fixed limitation on the amount of data that can be transmitted through this quantum communication system, and perhaps the bandwidth capability of this communication system is not great enough to support both video and audio communication. The command center module is dedicated to base building and transportation operations. The major feature of this module is a circular display that can be adapted to the current state of the base modules. Presumably, this would be the user interface by which the operator can move modules around, which we see from the exterior view. While this is a rather interesting approach to base management, this is perhaps a slightly over-engineered solution here, since, as we can see from gameplay, a standard screen showing the base modules from the exterior would work out pretty effectively to actually be able to perform this management, instead of a dedicated holographic display that we see in the game. This ring display is also mounted on some sort of sliding mechanism, which is rather curious as far as what its purpose would be here, but at the very least the mechanisms of the lever arms supporting the screen do at least appear to be capable of sliding in and out, allowing the arms to actually travel with the screen as it moves forward and backwards. Aside from the circular display, there are also two standard interfaces on either side of it, which presumably would be used for more general purpose computing applications that would go alongside the central base building computer. Here, the ceiling-mounted monitor display arms do make a little bit more sense, as behind the left one we see that there is a full-size desk, and behind the right screen there is what appears to be a large server rack, both of which you would want to preserve access to, whether for routine usage or occasional maintenance. The presence of the server rack here also would imply that this is a primary data storage module in the base, although it could perhaps be argued that the quantum computer module would probably make more sense as the primary computational element of the base. Instead, we could perhaps say that this server rack houses the mission-critical data storage and computational capacities necessary for the base operation in the first place. One of the displays on the background desk also has what appears to be a planetary system shown on the screen. We could perhaps take this to mean that when the base is being transported on its spacecraft, the crew is actually living on board the mobile base while the spacecraft is in motion, and remotely controlling it from the base command center. In any case, accessing telemetry from the carrier spacecraft would be beneficial on landing approaches, as well as maintaining contact after landing for orbital support. Lastly, we do see one or two fans in this room, which should probably be particularly helpful considering that the heat output from these servers and computers could perhaps make climate control of this room more difficult and make it less uncomfortable if adequate cooling was not available. Of course, you would probably want to design this cooling capability into the infrastructure of the base itself, but perhaps considering the modular design of the base, the environmental control and life support systems are generally sized to support the needs of other modules and not so much the higher load required of this one, hence the need for supplementary cooling. The dormitory module is the second living quarters that we can build on the base. Given the size of the original crew, based at least on the number of escape pods we could find at the beginning of the game, it is somewhat curious that this module is not already built onto the base, assuming that it was known ahead of time that more than one person would be undertaking this mission. Once we do get it built though, there is a large amount of space here for 4 crew members to sleep. Again, in reference to both spacecraft crew quarters and American apartments. One point I can attest to from personal experience here is the value of a little bit of privacy between the sleeping quarters of each crew member. One of the major challenges that can be faced during long missions in isolated and confined environments is the inability to escape from them. and so having a little bit of privacy in your personal area can provide a somewhat limited reprieve from the otherwise inescapable situation that you find yourself in. As we see in the dorm module, the beds only have partial walls next to them, which also have transparent dividers on them, whereas the amount of space available here could easily have allowed for walls to be put up between each of the beds, giving each crew member a small bedroom. Now, we could perhaps argue that this change was not made for gameplay purposes, so that you could watch the alters acting out their daily routine in the dormitory. From a habitat design perspective, though, this would be a rather simple and cheap architecture modification that could be made here. Recalling our previous discussion about circadian rhythms, it is nice to see that there is appear to be a colored light system for each bed that can display warmer colors to help crew members fall asleep more effectively. We can also make a brief discussion of the base's elevator modules. On the one hand, the elevators appear to use a rather simple rail system, which is capable of transporting people between floors at great speeds. We could suppose that this is some sort of magnetic levitation system, since there doesn't appear to be very much in the way of mechanisms to actually move the platform. There's also some informational text written on the elevator stating that the maximum capacity is 150 kilograms, or 330 pounds in Earth gravity, implying that the elevator is intended for personnel transportation more so than cargo. To this point, there is a secondary elevator shaft behind the first one, which is only ever used by the alters, apparently as a sort of maintenance or backup system. It's probably safe to say that the great speed of the elevator is primarily intended as a gameplay mechanic, as the rapid acceleration and deceleration traveling between multiple floors, especially back and forth when you're not sure where to go, could reasonably be expected to lead to uncomfortability in the person riding the elevator so quickly. Now, to that point, it is nice to see that there is some redundancy in the vertical transportation system between the base modules, even though one of them is rather out of the way from the primary walking space. But unfortunately, the elevator module is the only way that we have to access different levels of the base. Due to the limited visibility of the back room elevator, we could perhaps say that there's a sort of ladder hidden back there, but as an emergency egress route, it should be much more clearly visible if so. Redundancy in the elevators is nice in the event that one of them fails, but if both of them were to go down, crew members could be easily trapped on a certain level of the base. Assuming that only one set of elevator modules is implemented, like I did here. But even then, in the event of a total power failure of the base, crew members might not be able to actually escape. And as I'm sure any of you who have been in a tall building would know, in the event of a fire, you should not use the elevator, you should use water.
Cut out the sarcasm. It's not my fault this excursion was prepared by a dilettante.
The greenhouse module is perhaps one of the most important elements of the mobile base. Any human crew on a long-duration space mission is going to require a significant amount of food, and for space missions at great distances from Earth, it may be impractical or cost-prohibitive to deliver large quantities of food to the mission over long periods of time. Thus, space agriculture is almost certainly going to be an enduring feature of space travel for as long as humans are traveling the stars. A greenhouse module would also help to improve the ecological closure of the space habitat, essentially reducing the amount of matter required to maintain the ecological system that it is sustaining. Plants would be able to take carbon dioxide exhaled from the crew and turn it back into oxygen for them to breathe. And in the absence of a dedicated system to do so, a plant growth module would also provide a means of recycling waste matter from the crew. Historically, though, a completely closed ecological system has still not yet been accomplished, with the highest rating having been achieved by the BIOS program during the Soviet Union. Thus, while some external resources would still be necessary to maintain life support systems, plants could hopefully ease the burden on such systems within the base. Now, the only plant that we can conclusively say is being grown in the greenhouse is a turnip, for reasons I will not explain to avoid spoilers. However, based on appearances, it also appears that the back row of plants is butternut squash, and the middle row appears to resemble bell peppers. I would probably say that fruiting plants are more easy to accommodate than root plants like potatoes. Given the limited space available within the confines of the module, although if you knew the growth characteristics of your plants well enough, you could probably design an adequate space below the surface to allow the tubers and roots to grow sufficiently large. The inclusion of peppers is particularly applicable here, as oftentimes in space, astronauts will experience reduced sensitivities to taste due to internal fluid shifting within the body, essentially making them more congested and making it harder to taste things. Thus, spicier foods like peppers are more enjoyable in space because they make sure that you still get some flavor in your food. Now, this wouldn't be as much of a concern in a gravitational environment where this upward fluid shift would be less likely to occur, at least not to the same extent, but it would still be beneficial to add a little bit of flavor to your food. Assuming you're not like me with almost zero spice tolerance, and actually somewhat excited at the prospect of the spiciest food on the mission being the potato. Another thing to note about the plants we see in the greenhouse is the importance of crop rotation. This is generally done on Earth to avoid depletion of natural resources within the soil that would reduce the yield of the same crop if planted in the same field year after year. To avoid this, the practice of crop rotation is introduced by planting different crops in subsequent years that will recharge the soil with those depleted resources. In an otherwise unmonitored space greenhouse, this would have to be something you'd be aware of if you wanted to continue grow crops on an annular cycle, and so you'd want to have some different options for which plants you're growing in certain locations at any given point in time. This could perhaps be ameliorated, though, by adding in additional systems that would recharge the soil with these resources automatically, which would depend on the individual crops being planted. On a somewhat related topic, it is also worth noting that the growth of plants within soil is heavily dependent on the presence of microorganisms within that soil that help facilitate plant growth as part of the overall larger ecosystem. On Earth, this is a very good thing, but when you're traveling to other planets where you're potentially going to be searching for other life forms, this introduces the potential challenge of introducing contamination to these other worlds, or at the very least, scientific instruments that would be used to search for additional life. Thus, in this regard, it would be important to maintain an effective boundary between the microorganisms within the soil and whatever sort of instrumentation ever leaves the base, such as by establishing an effective sterilization or decontamination process for any external gear. We can also note that the greenhouse uses a ceiling sprinkler-based irrigation system to douse the plants with a dose of water from above. There is an additional machine in the center of the room with a large number of hoses connected throughout the facility, which could perhaps be part of a water recycling system. This is all well and good for the plants, but this could also potentially pose challenges for maintaining a comfortable and consistent humidity level across the rest of the base. An excessive amount of humidity could lead to condensation on cool surfaces, potentially leading to adverse effects with materials such as rust, whereas low humidity levels could potentially lead to increased likelihood of electrostatic discharges. Low humidity levels could also potentially contribute to health issues in the crew. Thus, whatever sort of environmental control systems are being used in the greenhouse would probably want to either be isolated from the rest of the base or have additional specialized hardware in place to deal with the added water content of the air that's being processed. While it may not be as directly tied to base functionality as some of the other modules, the gym module is perhaps one of the most important for maintaining crew efficacy during long missions. Now, in modern and historical space missions, maintaining a rigorous exercise routine is very important to preserve the operation of the human body, since in microgravity, the muscles in the body don't need to work nearly as hard as they do on the ground in order to actually keep you moving about, which will eventually lead to muscle atrophy and a decrease in overall strength. This is also the case for the heart, which is in itself a muscle and doesn't have to work as hard in microgravity in order to pump blood. This can pose a significant challenge for astronauts returning from space, and often after long-duration space missions, astronauts or cosmonauts need to be carried out of their return vehicles. Fortunately for us in the CEBA mobile base, we don't have most of these problems due to the presence of the planet's gravity. Nevertheless, maintaining physical health is going to be especially important for space missions, both for all the reasons that it's important on Earth, but also because it may be difficult or impossible to access timely medical care in the event of an emergency. The ability to exercise in your free time would also be a nice way of relieving some stress of the isolated and confined environment. Another notable design point of the gym module is that the fact that the base is in contact with the planetary surface means that you don't have to worry as much about vibrations being introduced into the primary structure by crew members who are exercising. This is a concern on modern-day spacecraft, where the forces imparted by somebody running on a treadmill, for example, could potentially introduce excessive loads or vibrations on the spacecraft primary structure that would need to be dealt with by propulsion systems if the vibrations of the exercise equipment were not isolated from the rest of the structure, which is an additional design requirement for existing space exercise equipment. As a result of the CEBA base sitting firmly on the ground of the planet we're on, we're able to use more familiar exercise equipment like treadmills and punching bags. Recalling our discussion about the sprinkler system in the greenhouse, you would also need to pay special attention to the humidity control equipment within the gym module, since perspiration from exercising astronauts introduces additional water into the air. Technically, the humidity control system within any particular module should be adequately sized to support perspiration from the number of people on the mission plus some reserve, but a dedicated gym module would be more likely to be introducing additional water into the overall base atmosphere. Thus, you could probably benefit from having some localized additional humidity control equipment. I also feel like around this point, it's probably relevant to state that from my experience playing this game, I can personally confirm that sweat from exercise doesn't stink. It's sweat from stress that actually does smell bad. Dedicated medical equipment is going to be a massive priority for long-duration space missions, and so having a dedicated infirmary module seems like a great idea here, especially when you can afford the space and mass requirements. As previously alluded to, due to the great distances from Earth, it may not be possible to transport somebody back to Earth in a timely manner in order for them to get the treatment they need. Thus, the more medical capabilities that can be brought with on the mission, the better. This would be especially applicable to an exploration mission, where outside of the standard human conditions that need to be worried about, there's also greater potential for injury or illness due to unforeseen circumstances that the explorers might encounter. Although a lot of the conditions that astronauts face today and in the past could perhaps be less of a concern on this mission due to the presence of gravity, which the human body is much better adapted to than microgravity. In addition to medical supply availability, though, there's also the potential challenge of medical expertise being available on the mission. Now, hopefully, the ship doctor would be capable of treating most common injuries that would most likely be encountered on the mission, but if a crew member were to encounter such a thing as a brain injury, for example, and you don't have a brain surgeon there, you might be out of luck. For space missions within the vicinity of Earth, this could potentially be alleviated in part through the use of telemedicine, but for missions traveling beyond communication range with Earth, the crew may need to fend for themselves more, and so just-in-time training and perhaps even AI assistance could perhaps become potentially very useful, provided that sufficient resources are available to facilitate this training or AI assistance. The in-game description of the Infirmary module states that automatic dispensers for pharmaceutical purposes are included in the module's functionality, perhaps one implementation of this AI assistance. The Infirmary module also only contains 2 patient beds, although in this case this may make a bit more sense than in the dormitory, since here each bed needs to have full access around it for potential medical attendance. The doctor's desk also has a deployable partition around the area, which could be useful for private medical procedures as well. The doctor's desk also features a poster reminding you once again to brush your teeth, which is still an important thing to be concerned about when you're on a space mission where you might not be able to get to an orthodontist if there was an issue with your teeth. Lastly, we can note several other pieces of equipment we see throughout the infirmary, such as an IV rack, a portable automatic electric defibrillator, a apparently rather large centrifuge, and several containers of what appear to be auto-injectors or EpiPens, all of which are things that a medical professional would probably be better qualified to comment on than me. While a dedicated kitchen module may not strictly speaking be a requirement for a space mission, having a dedicated space for the preparation and consumption of food could provide benefits to both technical efficiency as well as some potential psychological benefits. From a purely engineering perspective, having all of the food preparation equipment in a particular area would allow that area to be isolated from the rest of the base in terms of food safety requirements and cleanliness. For example, we can see that there is a sort of fume hood directly over top of the stove to prevent fire alarms from going off when people are cooking, unlike my current apartment, but that's another story. And as I'm sure anybody who's upgraded from a small apartment can verify, a larger kitchen space makes it much easier to cook more elaborate meals. A dedicated kitchen would also provide a location to store foodstuffs and other food preparation equipment, potentially making it harder to lose track of those items. In addition to purely technical benefits, the kitchen offers a number of psychological and social benefits to the space mission as well. Eating food together is highly ingrained in many Earth cultures as a way of socializing with other people. You can definitely tell I'm either an engineer or an alien from the way I worded that, but the point still stands. As a result, having a dedicated kitchen space to have meals together would provide a way to regularly socialize with the rest of the crew. The presence of a kitchen could also perhaps be a more familiar element of the base instead of just a food cabinet, since presumably most houses in the future would still have kitchens as well. There's also something to be said for having a dedicated space where you go and sit down and eat. At least for me, eating dinner at the dining table sort of acts as a bit of a reference point for me throughout the day, and gives sort of a mental break between the workday and the evening. This is of course a personal anecdote, but thought it might be helpful for you as well. As far as specific equipment goes, we see that the refrigerator has a combination freezer refrigerator, as well as another cold container on the countertop, which would be valuable both for more refreshing drinks, and also if you didn't want to rely on salt to preserve your foods. The dining table seems like it could comfortably sit between 7 and 9 people, which should hopefully be sufficient for a base and a crew of this size. And perhaps the most important piece of equipment in the whole base, the X38 Coffee Auto Barista, featuring what appears to be something like K-Cup pods that apparently can be combined to give different mixtures of flavors. There are also some small planters in the countertop area, which could be used for growing spices and herbs to be used for adding some variety to your dishes. And of course, as part of the obligatory space OSHA inspection, we say that there are clearly marked safety rules for operating kitchen equipment, as well as another very relevant reminder to go brush your teeth. The machinery module provides us with some additional information about the inner workings of the base. From the end of the prologue, we learn that the left element of the machinery module is related in some way to the engine test and thus the rest of the engine operation. This circular element also has a manual reactivation lever that resets the machine in some way. Additionally, we can see text on both elements in the machinery module, the word transformer. With all this in mind, and based on our previous analysis of the base as a whole, it's probably fair to say that the circular element of this module is some sort of internal combustion engine that takes organics as fuel and combusts them in the engine in order to turn a generator. The electrical output from this generator is then fed to the transformer element on the right side of the module, which could perhaps perform a step-down operation to convert the high voltage into high current, which would be more conducive for driving the electromagnets which drive the linear motors on the base outer wheels. The circular element on the left is probably more likely to be the internal combustion engine, since it possesses a mechanical interface for resetting the machine. The right element is also stated to have a mechanical reset as well, but this seems to be more intended as a servicing operation that could be done by a technician, instead of part of nominal operations. The computer on the circular element of the module also reports the current status of modules throughout the base and whether or not they're going to need maintenance soon. As with several other functionalities that we've discussed so far, it would probably be best to have this information accessible from the captain's quarters or the command center instead of at this particular location where the health monitoring of the rest of the base is undertaken. The machinery also seemingly contains the location where radiation filters are fed into the radiation barrier, but since this is a more involved topic, we'll discuss this in its own section. While it may not be something you typically think about with space travel, removal of waste is a core function of the human body and something that needs to be taken into account when designing human habitation. This process is simplified immensely by the presence of gravity, thus the facilities in the recycler module more closely resemble something we see on Earth. If you're really interested in it though, there is quite a lot of research and development that has gone into space toilets, which you can feel free to look up on your own. Basically though, the recycler is also probably going to be one of the more essential modules of the base, for both nominal human operation as well as contingency situations.
What happened in the kitchen? You look pale. Mild food poisoning, that's all. The fridge may be malfunctioning.
Another point to make here is that since the facilities in the recycler are very compact, it's not totally clear if there's actually a shower system in place here, which also is further simplified by the presence of gravity compared to what NASA did in space, although this is kind of suggested by the yellow and white mats on the ground outside the doorways. This would also be a great addition to the base, as current astronaut cleaning procedures are rather rudimentary in the absence of showers. This is also probably one of the few modules that could be well justified in building more than one of in the base. The Refinery module is admittedly one that I'm probably less familiar with the inner workings of. This module allows the conversion of one resource type to another, the first of which we see in game is the extraction of metals and organics from enriched metals. Presumably this involves some specialized chemical processes that can be used to separate out the organic compounds from the enriched metals, leaving behind purified useful metals. Since chemistry isn't really my strongest suit, I'll probably refrain from trying to come up with whatever process this is, but based on the visuals in this module, we do see a number of Rapidium containers, which we could suppose have some influence on the rate of reaction that the organic compounds are undergoing, which could potentially allow for the refinement process to be done faster than it would normally take. Throughout the game, we eventually unlock the ability to use the refinery to create other resources, which in general seems to be less plausible for a general-purpose refinement center to be able to perform advanced processing of materials that it wasn't originally designed for. Either that, or there's some very creative applications of this refinement engine of sorts to come up with other ways to progress these other chemical reactions and processes. I would probably defer to a chemical engineer on this subject, though. While it may not be considered essential, the presence of a research lab module is going to be highly beneficial for operations on an exploration mission to deep space. This one in particular is actually larger than some of the research labs I've worked in, and in fact seems like it could even support more equipment than we see in game. The general purpose nature of the lab, however, does lead to some complications, since you'll need to store a variety of equipment in this facility alone. We do see some various chemistry equipment, which, as I previously mentioned, is not really my strong suit, so I'll refrain from describing in too much detail, as well as a temperature-controlled refrigerator for use with chemistry as well as perhaps biological research. The research lab also has the essential microscope that every research lab totally has. Aside from the large adjustable whiteboard, which is somewhat over-designed, but not necessarily in a bad way, the defining feature of the laboratory is the massive gamer desk with a chair mounted on a sliding track to increase efficiency, which would be nearly unrivaled as far as battle stations go if it weren't for the absence of a keyboard and mouse. The different appearance of the central portion of the desk suggests that it could perhaps be a capacitive touchscreen of some sort, allowing it to be used as a keyboard and mouse interface, although this would probably not be as effective for gaming. Lastly, we can note that it is highly likely that the scientist is actually getting some significant research done in this lab by the amount of discarded cans and empty coffee mugs that we see throughout the room, which, at least in my experience, is indicative of a long night's work. Just as long as we're here, and since it's slightly relevant to this conversation, if you're ever going to be writing a master's thesis in your life, make sure you afford yourself more than about 1 month to actually complete it. Otherwise, it may require several 24-hour work periods to complete. Thought that might be somewhat relevant to somebody out there, and since we're already on the research lab, thought I might as well include that here just in case anybody could be helped by that. For a long duration stay in a stressful, isolated, and confined environment such as a space base, the social room is perhaps one of the most valuable elements of the base, at least from a human factors perspective. This room acts as a third place on the base, which is a third place outside of home and work that people can spend their time. In addition to being valuable for socialization, this also provides a means of least perceived escape from the otherwise confined environment that we would find ourselves in otherwise. The room is big enough for multiple activities to be enjoyed simultaneously, including beer pong, video game playing, movie watching, and listening to music. As far as specific implements, we see a dartboard where Jan Dulski is the obvious winner, what appears to be a futuristic jukebox, a refrigerator with presumably alcoholic drinks, and an accompanying beer pong table right next to it, a TV that is seemingly receiving a news broadcast, probably from Earth, which introduces some other considerations with faster-than-light communication travel that's discussed in the communications room, as well as a large sectional couch with a large coffee table for playing video games and watching movies on a fairly large screen. A cool note is that a lot of the video games that we see here are other games by 11-Bit Studios, the developers and publishers of the Alters. I'm not sure I personally would have picked Frostpunk as a good stress reliever, but if it works here, it works. Now, in most modern space habitats, a room of this size dedicated purely to social activities might be hard to justify from a strictly engineering perspective, considering how much of a premium habitable volume is when you're in the otherwise hostile environment of space. From personal experience, though, I can say that even on a smaller scale than this, having another location to go to for socialization is a nice way of mentally expanding the confines of the base you're stuck in, and also provides a nice opportunity to interact with other members of your crew, in particular in a way that's not strictly work-related. Also, while we're here, if you take nothing else away from this video, one of the most immediate things you can do to improve your quality of life as a result of playing this game is to go and watch Chris and Jack on YouTube. We can also briefly note that the base contains several module options for storage. In general, the storage requirement for a space mission is probably going to be heavily correlated to the distance away from Earth, or other human outposts in the future, as resupply missions will become more difficult the further away you get. This challenge could be exacerbated on missions where it is very unlikely that resupply could happen at all, such as the current mission, and also where exploration and sample collection are presumably primary objectives. Thus, the ability to add on additional storage modules after the vehicle is launched would allow the base to be adapted to storage needs. The workshop is another module that is going to be particularly useful for long-duration space missions with a focus on exploration. For missions with well-defined parameters, it's easier to include all the necessary tools and equipment before launch. However, with a more open-ended exploration or research mission, such as the one we're currently on now, unforeseen scenarios might come up that might require additional or different tools than the mission already has available. As such, having the equipment available to manufacture your own tools or equipment is going to be very valuable for these more uncertain or less defined missions. The workshop could also be used to help repair equipment that is broken down during the mission or that would require an upgrade. The primary feature of the workshop is a very large 3D printing machine with a conveyor belt to bring the printed object out to a series of manipulator arms as well as the human operator. From what we see in-game, this 3D printer appears to be capable of printing technological components in addition to purely structural items like with modern printers, suggesting that there is some additional technology inside it, perhaps involving some automated assembly processes. This can include additional robotic arms or manipulators to install electronic assemblies into printed ones, or perhaps these parts of the assembly process could be done by the human operator. To make implementation of these technological components easier, it would probably be more effective to include general-purpose semiconductor components, or basically Arduino boards, that could be installed into various 3D printed assemblies and then programmed on the fly for their specific application. Also, while we don't really see it being implemented in this way, the conveyor belt coming out of the 3D printer resembles that of an infinite build volume printer, which could allow the machine to produce very large objects if necessary. Arguably tied with the quantum computer as the most complex element of the base from a technological level, the womb module is central to the Alter's story and brings about many of the philosophical points we have to consider in the game. Now, as you could probably imagine from me being an engineer and not a biologist, and a guy, frankly, I'm not especially knowledgeable on all the inner workings of these biological processes. So I will gladly defer to an expert in this field since this is a totally different world than mine, but I will do my best to explain this as best as I can. In essence, the womb module creates an appropriate environment for biological development of animal cells, starting from an embryonic stage progressing up to an adult, accelerated in this case by Rapidium. The original starting cells are provided by what is called in-game a DNA sample from the original organism. Now, if we were just going to stop here, this level of technology doesn't seem totally outlandish. If the conditions for proper embryonic development are well enough understood, then theoretically they could be replicated in a mechanical system. Spoken like somebody who doesn't know anything about medicine, but this at least makes sense on a conceptual level. As for obtaining cells to be cloned in the first place, there is some historical basis for this concept. The most famous and most directly related example is the case of Dolly the sheep, the first healthy cloned organism that lived to adulthood. In the nearly 3 decades since this experiment, animal cloning has become a much more understood process, with perhaps the most relevant to our situation being the cloning of 2 crab-eating macaques named Zhang Zhang and Hua Hua, which I'm probably mispronouncing, I do apologize. Aside from the fact that this process has not yet been successfully accomplished with humans, and probably hasn't even been attempted, really, the process used to create Dolly and the macaques, known as somatic cell nuclear transfer, requires a female egg cell to begin with. Thus, we would run into some difficulties implementing this process in our current situation. A more broadly applicable technique could involve the use of induced pluripotent stem cells. At a very basic level, stem cells are capable of differentiating into the various types of cells found throughout the body, such as liver or brain cells. Potency of stem cells, or their ability to differentiate, generally decreases throughout the advancing age of a biological organism. The next stage after pluripotency would be multipotency, where, for example, hematopoietic stem cells could differentiate into white or red blood cells. However, adult cells that have already been differentiated can be reprogrammed to attain their pluripotency once again, which are known as induced pluripotent stem cells. It's important to note that none of this has anything to do with embryonic stem cells, which is a totally different topic. Through the use of these induced pluripotent stem cells, we could suppose that with sufficient advanced medical technology, a series of properly edited induced pluripotent stem cells could in theory be used to grow an entire organism based off of a single cell, or a small number of cells. Again, this is coming from someone with very little background in medicine, but if nothing else, at the very least, we are so far still within the bounds of currently understood physics, and thus we do not yet require the use of a miracle exception to explain how the womb module operates.
Besides, I can see no other explanation for a sheep inside a space base.
Now that all changes once we start to consider the alteration process that we see in game. In order to create an alter with different memories from the original organism, the womb module would need to be capable of rewiring the brain during its developmental process, such that the adult organism's brain is one that would possess the neural pathways consistent with those of a natural organism containing those same memories. In other words, the quantum computer needs to understand the neurological structure of each of the memories that it is creating, and the womb module is then responsible for creating those neurological structures. Now, while I could technically say that I have some amount of informal, third-hand knowledge of neuroscience, attempting to explain this process through the use of currently understood physics would be far beyond my current capabilities, as it seems to be beyond the capabilities of current modern medicine. Translating this problem into my world, if the previous point about the womb being capable of growing an organism was essentially the biological equivalent to the mathematical statement, a solution exists, then having the system being capable of implanting memories during the growth process would almost be akin to saying, solve this system of partial differential equations. One small credit I'll mention that could be used for this process could be something along the line of epigenetics, which for the purposes of this discussion would be modification of an organism's genes based on its life experiences. If this epigenetic correlation between life experiences and neurological structures corresponding to memories could perhaps be well enough understood, then perhaps the womb would be able to program these genetic markers into the organism such that its final developmental stage is equivalent to one with the memories implanted. But I don't think I can say whether or not this would make things harder or easier to achieve the end result. And so at the point of all this, which you probably picked up on by now, is that creating an arbitrary modification of perhaps the most complex system known to humanity is probably beyond the understanding of modern medicine and would thus require at least one miracle exception to explain. Now, if you, the viewer, have more experience in this field than I do, and are able to point out any mistakes or inconsistencies with what I've just described, first of all, I'm sorry, and second, I would be very interested to hear your take on this complex subject. I would also mention that if you're not a medical professional and you go looking up this stuff on Wikipedia, just be careful not to get yourself flashbanged by hovering on the wrong link accidentally. Medical professionals are just built different.
Well, if you want to succeed in the world of science, you need a strong stomach and a thick skin.
The quantum computer is without a doubt one of the two most complex modules of the base, with the other being the womb. Now, while classical computer science and computer engineering is much more within my realm of expertise than biology, quantum computer science is very much its own thing, which operates on its own laws of physics that are very different from those of classical computing, at least at some level. And since I'm only able to explain these things to the level at which I understand them, this will be a rather surface level section. And as usual, if you understand this subject better than me, please feel free to expand on this in the comments. Just as classical computers use information bits to represent logical values of 1 and 0, with sequences of bits being used to store more information, quantum computers utilize qubits to store collections of those values of 0 and 1. As for what a qubit actually is in physical sense, there are multiple ways of actually implementing them, but the most interesting and rather prevalent one nowadays is with superconducting atoms, which allows the manufacturing of qubit chips in a manner similar, to some extent, to classical computing chips. Keep in mind these are superconductors, not semiconductors, which brings up some additional challenges we'll discuss shortly. But to understand how qubits work, we first need to understand at some level how quantum entanglement works. At a very basic level, two particles can be said to be quantumly entangled if you can obtain information about one of the particles through measurement of the other. Probably the best way to explain this that I've seen is from the physicist John Stuart Bell, whose name will come up again later in this video. If you knew that somebody always wore two different colors of socks, then by observing the color of one of their socks, you could then say that the sock on the other foot is not that color. Now that's quantum entanglement, which we'll come back to shortly. Now the other idea that is fundamental to the definition of qubits is quantum superposition. Now to explain this at a basic level again, we need to understand that a qubit does not have any particular value until it is measured. Rather, it has probabilities of that value being realized. This is technically true for any quantum system outside of qubits, but we're not going to go there right now. Because the qubit has only a certain probability of having a value of either 0 or 1, that means that as long as you don't measure the qubit, its value will technically consist of a probability of being 0 and a probability of being 1, which is termed superposition. And more specifically, this is a coherent superposition, which decoheres into a single value upon being measured. Okay, that's almost all the quantum physics we need to go through to explain this, so we're almost there. Because measurement of a qubit ruins its superposition, once you acquire an output from the qubit, it's no longer very useful, at least not as much as it was when it was in a superposition. So instead of measuring a qubit directly, you entangle it with another qubit, putting them in the same quantum state, and then measure the entangled qubit. This is done through quantum logic gates, which have some analog to classical computing logic gates. Now this all sounds like a lot of trouble to do a single measurement, so the question might be asked, why would you want to do this? Well, one particularly important reason is that since qubits are operating on superpositions and not exclusively a 1 or a 0, if you're able to program a qubit with a particular superposition, then you can perform some operation on this superposition of states, which will give you a different superposition at the end of the operation. So if you consider the input superposition to be input variables, then you can effectively solve simultaneously for a large number of variables using a single operation. This is known as quantum parallelism. What all of this really boils down to is that in some particular circumstances, this method of computation may be more effective and faster at solving particular mathematical problems than if these calculations were to be performed by a classical computer. Now, while the theory of quantum computers has been around since the 80s, modern applications of quantum computers is still somewhat limited. This is partly due to the fact that classical computers are so far ahead of quantum ones that there are very few problems that a quantum computer can solve faster than a classical computer at this point in time, at least from a commercial perspective. Perhaps the bigger challenge, though, is the fragility of quantum computing systems. Since qubits lose their superposition of states when they are measured, it is vitally important that they be kept isolated from the outside environment, since even something as minute as a slight vibration from somebody walking around outside the computer, or a random cosmic ray passing through the qubit itself, could provide enough input to cause the qubit to decohere into a non-superposition state. One result of this is that modern quantum computers can only operate for a certain amount of time before the qubits decohere and need to be reset or discarded. This certain amount of time is usually less than 1 millisecond. Now, during recording, Harvard did report a breakthrough in a quantum computer that was able to operate for up to 2 hours, which continually replaced lost qubits with new atoms. Also, to give another idea of the scale of modern quantum computing, the system replaced 30,000 qubits per second used to maintain their array of 30,000 atoms, which numerically is about the same as 250 kilobytes of classical memory. To actually achieve this isolation, in some types of quantum computers at least, this requires superconducting materials, which as of time of recording can currently be only achieved with cryogenic temperatures pretty close to absolute zero. This requires extensive cooling apparatus for superconducting quantum computers, such as the dilution refrigerator system, the characteristic downward lattice shape of which is common among quantum computer designs and is represented in the altars as well. So after all that crazy physics and advanced engineering, you can probably get the idea that quantum computers are rather difficult to implement, to put it lightly. So, now that we have some level of understanding of quantum computers, at least theoretically, we can take a look at how this advanced technology is implemented in the altars. In-game, the simulation capabilities of the quantum computer seems to be on the order of the computational capabilities required to run the Matrix. While avoiding spoilers to the greatest extent possible, the quantum computer takes transcribed human memories, which have been uploaded into computer memory, and then runs alterations of those memories to eventually find a compatible sequence of events, resulting in a timeline of the altar ending up on the mission. Now, one thing we can quickly get out of the way is that in order for the quantum computer to have memories to work off of, this requires some way to upload memories from a human brain into the computer, which, as we briefly discussed during the womb module, would likely involve some mapping of neurological structures to individual memories. This seemingly is something undertaken by the crew before every mission, for corporate reasons, and it's not immediately clear if this is actually something done by the quantum computer itself, so we can assume for the sake of making our lives slightly easier that this is not a task of this particular module. Once these memories are acquired, the computer would somehow need to be able to interpret what each memory means in such a way that it can simulate the behavior of the individual down to very minute details, and doing so over the course of years to eventually arrive at the point where they join the mission. Not only is this being done for the individual, but the implication would be that the quantum computer would also need to simulate the actions of others whose mind records are not available in order to determine the paths that the altar would take. Now, I won't spoil it here, but it is revealed in-game whether or not the quantum computer simulations reflect real life accurately. Thus, for the purposes of our analysis, the quantum computer would effectively have to run not just one matrix simulacrum, but also a perhaps near infinite number of simulations to find one in which the altar arrives on the Ally Corp mission. This nigh unfathomable level of computation would also have to be recorded for the perhaps less complex task of translating these simulated events into neurological structures for implantation into the brain of the created altar. Now, we could probably say at this point that this is very likely to be an impossibility for modern computing systems, or at the very least would require a stupidly large amount of computational resources, perhaps something akin to a Jupiter brain, or at the very least something bigger than a quantum computer module. Attempting to explain this then would require us to reduce the level of complexity required of these simulations. This could conceptually be done by reducing the number of variables that the quantum computer needs to calculate, which could perhaps be similar to a concept of reducing the resolution of the matrix. The quantum computer knows that the altar will eventually end up on the mission, so perhaps once it determines a low-resolution sequence of events that leads to that end result, it can simulate that timeline further, to produce the high amount of detail that we see in the altar's experiences. Now, this approach is somewhat limited by the fact that we have to essentially determine the equation we're solving in addition to all of its variables. So, perhaps if we knew the equation ahead of time, we would be able to solve for the variables much more easily. However, in order for us to consider the implications of this theory, we will need to do a lot more digging into theoretical physics, which fortunately is another big topic of this game that we will discuss later. This probably won't make the quantum computer totally realistic, but it might at least make it seem a little bit more understandable. So for now, we'll leave the discussion of the quantum computer as is, with the understanding that even with the capability to solve immense numbers of equations simultaneously, with techniques such as quantum parallelism, the sheer number of variables that would need to be solved for here still makes this level of computational capability a very tall order. As a final note on our discussion of base modules, I will note that there are a few more modules that we are able to build throughout the game, but just mentioning some of them would introduce pretty major spoilers. So since we've done a pretty thorough analysis of the base module so far, we'll conclude it here in the interest of preserving the gameplay experience for people who are still watching this video after not playing the game first. In addition to modules within the CEBA base, we are also able to build some deployable elements that can be placed around the environment outside of the base. In context, this makes perfect sense for a space mission. However, the mechanism by which these structures are constructed seems to imply some level of nanotechnology being used to construct them in a very rapid manner. This is presumably just a gameplay mechanic, but if we were to be very strict about our miracle exceptions rule, then this rapid construction capability would probably necessitate the inclusion of rapid self-assembling nanomachines as another element of the game that we can't really totally explain with current understandings of physics. Since while the potential for this technology is immense, it is still a long ways off from being developed to this point of capability. The first deployable mechanism we are able to utilize is the mining outpost. Now, I will briefly note that I am not super experienced with the oil and gas industry, and so if you have more knowledge on the inner workings of these machines or techniques, please feel free to leave a comment to correct me. The mining outpost appears to be using a guided auger-type drill to be used for the extraction of various resources from deep underground. Now, for the extraction of organics, which appear to be in a fluid state, this machinery closely resembles drilling machines that we've seen on Earth. This particular mechanism seems like it would work well enough, as it provides a means for pressurized fluids underground to be fed up to the surface. The turning motion of the auger also serves to translate materials upwards. However, the drill itself is exposed before it reaches what is presumably the collection point near the top of the drill, which would mean that anything the auger is carrying would leak out to the surface at this area. And as such, the drill would need to remain enclosed between the surface of the ground and the collection point where the material can be extracted from it. It could also be possible that the center of the drill shaft is cored out and extracted materials are flown up through this central channel to reach the extraction point. Now, this process seems fairly feasible enough for when you're dealing with fluidic resources, but it's challenged a bit more when you're considering solid materials. While the auger may be mechanically capable of translating solid materials upwards, the friction of the solid material against the borehole might make it more difficult, efficiency-wise, to bring the resources all the way back up to the surface. This process could perhaps be improved with the addition of a drilling fluid, which essentially is the introduction of a fluidic compound into the borehole via the drill, perhaps through that central channel in the drill, which then collects and carries upwards the various drill cuttings or solid materials that the drill is cutting away. This would perhaps result in a more complex mechanism, but it may also allow the drilling machine to maintain compatibility with the presumably fluids-based material transportation system that is used to pipe resources back to the base. If properly implemented, then this could perhaps allow the drilling machine to go after all three phases of matter underground. Before deploying a mining outpost, the polygonal scanner can be used to identify ideal locations for resource extraction. These devices appear to make use of ground-penetrating radar, which functions by emitting radio waves downwards into the ground and measuring reflected signals back off of the interfaces between different materials underground. By combining multiple of these sensors together, a three-dimensional representation of the subsurface composition can be determined from data fusion from multiple sensors, and this three-dimensional mapping can then be displayed in augmented reality, presumably on the visor of the user's spacesuit. Now, antenna science gets pretty complex and goes pretty far into electrical engineering, which is not my direct specialty, but my understanding would be that in order for this to be functional, you would have to calibrate the receiving antennas as well as possibly the radar emitters to properly identify the correct interface between materials that points to the resource you have in question. For example, if you had the system calibrated for liquid organics underground, the reflected radio waves off of minerals might not match the pattern that is being searched for by the algorithms. This could also be complicated by the uncertain composition of the ground in which these resources are buried. If there are interfaces between various types of rock, for example, then this could potentially affect the scattering and reflection of the radio waves and potentially even generate false positives. This could be why that, at least in my experience, it was usually necessary to place quite a few of these scanning probes down, since the system must first take a little bit of time to calibrate itself so it can properly function with the rock that it's placed on. Curiously, this system also can be used to identify Rapidium underground, which seems a bit odd considering that the properties of Rapidium are not very well known at this point. It also appears that the scanning system is programmed to identify the highest yield location for drilling operations, more so than just simply detecting the presence of a material, and so additional scans would be required to identify the distribution of these resources underground. Once the mining outposts have been established, they must be connected to the base using pylons. These are essentially just towers connecting tubes and cables back to the base, which at that point interface with the base's resource collection system. It could probably be argued that a simpler solution would be to just manually connect a tube and cable to the mining outpost that you're looking to connect. But the pylon system does have the advantage of multiple branches being supported from a single pylon, and if you have this magical nanotechnology available to you, you might as well use it. A counterpoint to this could be that the connecting lines between pylons are more susceptible to wind loads than a cable and pipe laying on the ground. However, by being elevated, the lines are avoiding exposure to the ground where they could perhaps be cut or damaged if they are potentially moved incorrectly, and also means that they don't act as a tripping hazard. The automatic connection of pylons also is convenient for exploration purposes, where the exact route of a cable doesn't need to be plotted out as exactly as simply placing two pylons in appropriate distance from each other. In addition to the basic pylons and their larger hub variants, we are also able to construct travel pylons. These versions of the structure incorporate a charging location for the suit battery, which could potentially be very useful far away from the base, but also as their primary function feature a fast travel destination. This is also a key feature of the mining outposts as well. Now, if we were to look at this as literally as possible, this would seem to imply the existence of some form of teleportation technology, since going from one fast travel point to another doesn't actually take up any time out of the day. I think it's probably fair to say that this is primarily implemented as a gameplay mechanic, and for it to be more realistic, the developers could have perhaps made it so that time is spent when you go from one fast travel location to another. Either that, or we can add teleportation to our list of required miracle exceptions. The Vertara drill is another mining-related implement that we can use for very specific applications. When activated, 12 laser beams provide enough energy to melt and then vaporize any rocks in front of the drill. While this would be quite a hazardous implement to use in most situations, it does have the benefit here of requiring minimal input from the operator, thus reducing the chance for injury or damage to the spacesuit during physical operations to remove rocks. Now, from an engineering perspective, one of the primary challenges here is not so much in the lasers that are being used to melt the rocks, as the heat dissipation and power delivery inside the drill itself. In order to provide enough energy to the rocks in order to physically melt them and vaporize them, that energy must first be transmitted through the lasers, which in order to do that, the lasers must be generated using diodes in the drill. Since thermodynamically we can't have a perfectly efficient system, there has to be at least some waste heat produced as a result of this operation, which will probably be a non-insignificant percentage of the total energy fed into the diodes. The total energy delivered from the power supply has to be great enough to vaporize the material of the rocks, as well as account for any waste heat produced by the diodes. Even assuming that we are able to have a power source that's capable of delivering this much energy in this much time, the high levels of energy would mean that even for high levels of efficiency, you're probably going to get quite a lot of waste heat produced by these laser diodes. This would then explain why in-game, the laser drill requires cartridges to operate, which are one-time use items. Most likely, this means that the drill cartridge burns itself up every time it's used. This cartridge could perhaps be more sensitive electronics that are required for the lasers to operate, and perhaps an accompanying power distribution system that is capable of routing these immense amounts of energy. On another point about this drill, I cannot figure out what the name Vertara is supposed to mean. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be Vertara, one word, or Vertara, as is seen on the implement itself, but I can't find a good example of what either of these terms are supposed to mean. So if this makes more sense to you, please let me know in the comments, because I'm still pretty confused. At this point, we can effectively conclude our analysis of the technical elements of the game. Granted, there are some things I left out here, but I do want to leave at least some amount of surprise to the people who are watching this video before playing the game. And so with that, we can transition from our analysis of the engineering aspects of the game over to planetary science topics. The planet we find ourselves on in the Altars is described as belonging to a triple star system. This turns out to be bad news for us though, as the approach of the third star results in the surface of the planet being scorched. Thus, the mission has to be completed before the destructive rise of the third sun. Current stellar catalogs do have quite a few examples of trinary star systems, as I'll probably keep referring to them here in remembrance of my Destiny playing days. But there are not many known trinary star systems that possess exoplanets as well. Based on the way it's described in the game, the planet we find ourselves on is most likely located in a P1 orbit around the central binary inside the orbit of the third star. It could be possible that the planet is in an S1 or S2 orbit. However, considering we do still see the sun rise and set on this planet, this would seem to be less likely unless one of the two inner stars was much dimmer than the other, since the revolution of the planet in its orbit must still be capable of producing day and night cycles. This is not technically impossible in one of these orbits, although it would be less likely to occur in a regular cadence like we see in-game. It also seems less likely that we would find our planet in a P2 orbit, due in part to the regularity with which the third sun scorches the planet's surface, and that an outer orbit such as this would have a much longer period than an inner one, while an S3 orbit would imply that the inner binary is the scorching star, which, while perhaps possible, is at least not the nomenclature used in the game. Thus, it seems most likely that in our search for a trinary star exoplanet, we would be looking for a P1 orbit type. Now, if I were to tell you how long it takes in-game for the scorching star to arrive, that would kind of remove a lot of the sense of urgency from the game. So we'll just stick with the rather cryptic data point that the scorching star orbits with a period on the order of days. Now, I will admit that orbital mechanics is not really one of my strongest suits, so feel free to correct me if you have more knowledge on this subject. Now, after a brief review of some of the more studied triple star systems known from Earth, there were several possible star systems that could perhaps be home to the planet from the Altars, including one with a tentative discovery of an exoplanet by a Polish astronomer, but from the data I reviewed, it seems like the star system that we have most likely found ourselves in is HD 181068. This is just a stellar catalog descriptor, and the system was unofficially given the name Trinity by the astronomers who discovered it. Unusually, this is a triply eclipsing star system, which means that based on the way that it is oriented in relation to Earth, all three of the stars will at some point eclipse each other as viewed from our planet. This provides us with a lot of opportunities to observe the system in different configurations, resulting in more than average amount of data available on the system. The two inner stars of the Trinity system orbit each other, or more specifically, orbit a point in space between each of the two stars, known as a barycenter. This inner binary orbit completes every 0.906 Earth days, or 21.7 hours, which, while not directly describing the orbit of a potential exoplanet, could at least imply that the orbit of a potential circumstellar disk that could be planet-forming could also potentially have had a similar orbital period, although this brings us into stellar evolution, which is a much more involved subject that I'm definitely not an expert in. The outer star also orbits the barycenter of the inner two stars, with an orbital period of 45.5 days. Again, I'm not going to say how close this is to what we see in the Altars, but it's at least on the same order of magnitude. So if we were to have a P1 type orbiting exoplanet within the HD 181068 star system, its orbital characteristics would seem to line up with the behavior of the planet that we see within the Altars. Owing to the triply eclipsing nature of the star system, we also have data on the occurrence of solar flares. From data provided by the Kepler Space Telescope, 7 solar flares were identified, all of which most likely originated from the larger third star in the system. The paper I found this in also noted that in some trinary star systems, the approach of the third star to the binary pair could potentially influence the degree and intensity of solar flares on the third star, and although it was noted that this was not confirmed for HD 181068, it was not ruled out either. So this outer third star has a tendency to produce solar flares, which could possibly be influenced by the proximity of the inner binary pair, which once again sounds somewhat similar to the scorching sun seen in the Altars. As a result, while no exoplanets have as of yet been discovered in this star system, it seems that HD 181068 is probably the most likely real-life candidate for the location of the planet upon which we have been stranded. As part of our planetary science review, we can briefly investigate some of the exogeological features that we encounter on the planet. This is a very broad subject, so I'll keep it rather brief, but one primary point to point out is the presence of volcanic activity on the planet's surface. This would indicate the presence of a liquid mantle beneath the surface, which could also suggest a hot molten liquid core, but an alternative solution that may at least be in part be responsible for the liquid mantle could in part be the effects of tidal heating. As a result of gravitational forces from significantly larger astronomical bodies that are nearby this planet, the very material that the planet is made of shifts beneath its surface, resulting in friction that leads to heat. The Jovian moon Io is a good example of tidal heating leading to volcanism, where the gravitational pull of Jupiter is great enough to cause the moon to erupt. Interestingly, tidal heating is also suspected of increasing the temperature of subsurface oceans on icy moons such as Europa and Enceladus, which could potentially be beneficial for the development of life in those areas. And of course, these gravitational pulls are responsible for creating tides like the ones we see on Earth. In the case of the Alters, since the planet is within a triple star system, it would likely be experiencing very large gravitational forces from multiple larger astronomical bodies that seemingly have not torn the planet to pieces, but would definitely contribute greatly to tidal heating effects, especially during the approach of the scorching star. Furthering this point, this would also seem to indicate that the location of the planet's orbit would need to be very particular in order to prevent the planet from being destroyed by gravitational forces of the 3 suns in its orbital system. But I'll probably leave that discussion for a dedicated planetary scientist to answer. The other point we might discuss on exogeology are the resources that we can extract from the planet. As part of our discussion of the CEBA Base, we considered that the organics deposits would include hydrocarbons that could potentially be used as fuel. It's also worth noting that the term organic refers to carbon-containing compounds and not necessarily living material. For metal deposits, we would most likely be wanting to extract iron and perhaps other alloying metals such as chromium for the production of steel to be used in base building, or perhaps aluminum or titanium if those ones are available. Copper compounds could also be potentially useful for electronics manufacturing. We also find irradiated deposits of enriched metals, which can be processed to separate out organics and metals. The radioactive nature of these deposits suggests that more unstable isotopes of useful metals and organics are present in these areas. Probably the most broadly useful deposits we can find, though, are for minerals. Since this is not very well defined, this could include materials such as silicates, which would be useful for semiconductor manufacturing, as well as rare earth minerals, which would be essential for manufacturing high-value electronic devices. And of course, there is Rapidium, which we've already discussed in its own section. If the base is intended to be upgradable during expeditions, then its architecture and material selection would benefit from being constrained to the resources that an expedition team would most likely have the resources to extract during their mission. As a hypothetical counterexample, if a significant portion of the base was constructed from gold, then unless you found a planetary or asteroid resource rich in that material, you might not be able to construct more modules for the base during the mission or repair existing modules. So since the useful resources that we're looking for depend heavily on the architecture of the base, I'll keep this section rather surface level, and any material scientists or metallurgists who are watching can leave their recommendations in the comments. There are also some remarks we can make regarding the atmosphere of the planet we find ourselves on. Immediately, we can note the presence of rain and storm clouds in the sky, which, together with the ocean, indicates that the planet has some form of water cycle. The presence of clouds also mean that the atmosphere at least has some substantial thickness, and thus presumably a measurable surface pressure as well. Again, considering that we are using hydrocarbons as fuel for the base, we could then infer that the atmosphere must have some amount of oxygen in it. Perhaps not enough for humans to breathe comfortably, but at the very least this could indicate the presence of oxygen-containing compounds. Also, without being too much of a spoiler, we do see that the planet's atmosphere is prone to very strong winds, which are likely influenced to a great extent by the presence of the 3 suns, further indicating that the planet has a substantial atmosphere. Now, this may just be a gameplay feature, but we don't ever actually have to worry about water consumption as part of the base management. We could then take this to mean that the planet's oceans, and thus its rain and clouds, consist of water, making it plentifully available for human consumption or for any other chemical purposes, such as electrolysis into fuel and oxidizer. With all this in mind, it seems that it is not totally unlikely that the atmosphere of the planet is, to some extent at least, conducive to supporting human life, barring only perhaps the presence of significant enough oxygen to make the air breathable. If the atmosphere is thick enough for such weather conditions to form, then we could also presume that it has a not insignificant heat capacity, which could perhaps be enough to raise the temperature of the planet's surface to above the cryogenic temperatures of typical space rocks. Of course, this analysis has been rather surface level, and we're just looking at a conceptual level here, but we could perhaps say that if the presence of human life is not supported by this planet, it could still potentially support the presence of other life. A great challenge to this, though, would be the approach of the scorching star, which would presumably strip away great amounts of the atmosphere every time it approaches, due to the intense solar winds that the planet would experience. The planet's atmosphere could then potentially be replaced, to some extent at least, by the volcanic activity of the planet and the planet's oceans. The planet would still eventually be losing mass though, and so in the absence of additional factors, this process would not be sustainable. However, there are external factors to consider here, namely Rapidium, and if I say any more, it'll probably get into spoilers, so we'll leave it at that. In addition to the hazard of being burned up by the approaching third star, we also have to deal with magnetic storms that can occur periodically on the planet. On Earth, geomagnetic storms occur as a result of interaction between the solar wind and the Earth's magnetosphere. The interactions with solar plasma and Earth's magnetic field can result in large induced currents on electrical equipment at the surface of the planet. These storms have the potential to be quite damaging to existing infrastructure, and the best and most cited example of this is the Carrington event, named after Richard Carrington, who on September 1st, 1859, made the first records of a solar flare. On that same day and the one following, the high-energy particles from the sun reached the Earth, creating the most intense geomagnetic storm in recorded history. Now, this being 1859, nobody had their online gaming interrupted by the event, but it was still powerful enough to cause electrical sparks and fires on telegraph wires, resulting in several minor injuries to telegraph operators. Now, since the Carrington event, there have been other serious solar storms, but none as intense as that one. This is still a very real concern on Earth today, though, since at the time of the Carrington event, there was not a worldwide infrastructure solely reliant upon effective electrical communications, the disruption of which by a solar storm could potentially have severe ramifications. Solar storms do occur more often than this, though, and most of the time they're not noticeable enough to affect ground-based equipment. With this in mind, then, the fact that the magnetic storms that we experience in the altars are capable of disrupting the functionality of the base modules implies that these solar particle events are very strong indeed. Based on our orbital mechanics analysis, we can say that these solar flares are probably coming from the third outer star, although the inner binary pair could also potentially be producing them. There is one slight upside to these events, though. When the solar particles arrive at the planetary atmosphere, they impact atmospheric particles. Impacting electrons will recombine with ionized atoms, and impacting protons, or heavier particles, will introduce additional energy to atmospheric molecules. In both of these interactions, photons are emitted, producing light. The end result of these many particle interactions is massive swaths of bright and beautiful colored lights, which we on Earth would know as the aurora borealis, spread across a significant portion of the planetary atmosphere, and definitely not localized entirely within one's kitchen. The final planetary science topic we have to discuss is the important subject of radiation. Now, most immediately, we see throughout the game that radiation levels spike during the night, making it extremely hazardous to stay out late. The base, however, has some level of radiation shielding, but as long as radiation filters are supplied, can keep the crew safe. Now, there's a fair amount to break down here, so we can start with the presence of the nighttime radiation, which would seem to indicate that, at least in part, its presence is due to the planet's rotation. Now, hold on to that, we'll come back to it in a second. But first, it's important to note that there are essentially two different types of radiation that we might encounter in space. The first and more common, which we have already discussed, would be solar energetic particles, which are emitted from stars in the form of solar wind. Other sources of these particles are solar flares, coronal mass ejections, and solar particle events. These generally consist of gamma and X-rays, as well as small energetic particles such as protons and electrons. The other, potentially more hazardous type is galactic cosmic radiation, otherwise known as cosmic rays, although they're not technically rays, but they're technically particles, which are also waves, but that's not the point. GCR mostly consists of ionized atomic nuclei, giving them much greater mass and having significant amounts of energy as well. This also makes it harder to shield against GCR than solar energetic particles. GCR is probably less of a concern in this situation though, since at least in the vicinity of Earth, more intense solar wind serves to reduce the amount of incoming GCR. Now, we also mentioned earlier that interactions between the stars and the planet's magnetosphere could result in the occurrence of magnetic storms, which we see also produces additional radiation. From this, we infer that the planet does possess a magnetic field, which would serve to shield the planet's surface from space radiation. This is the case with Earth, which is why we're not totally irradiated from the nearby massive ball of flaming plasma. However, in the case of the planet and the altars, we have a much different space weather environment than we do at Earth, and the interactions between the planet's magnetic field and the solar wind from 2 or 3 stars, and potentially those stars' magnetic fields as well, could potentially lead to some unusual or unfamiliar effects. Now recall that we said that the planet's rotation seems to be at least in part responsible for the presence of harmful radiation. We also see that as the scorching star approaches, night radiation starts earlier. This would seem to indicate that the approaching star is at least partly responsible for this phenomena. If we also recall from a previous discussion that the planet most likely has a P-type orbit around the inner binary pair of stars, then we could suppose that the planet's magnetosphere effectively shields the planet from the solar wind from the binary pair on the daytime side of the planet. On the nighttime side, however, the magnetosphere appears to suffer an injection of radiation, presumably resulting from solar particle events from the approaching scorching star. These incoming particles would need to be strong enough to break through the magnetic field that would otherwise be shielding the planet from a solar wind. If we take this to be the case, this would imply that the scorching star is highly active, frequently emitting high-energy particles that are capable of breaching this magnetic shield. Could alternatively suppose that within the vicinity of this star system, the galactic cosmic radiation is more intense than it is at Earth, and in the absence of the blocking solar wind, the GCR component of incoming space radiation is more significant on the night side of the planet. And perhaps during the approach of the scorching star, the ability of the planet's magnetosphere to shield against GCR is reduced. Personally, I would think this option would be less likely, considering that there is less of a direct correlation between the approach of the scorching star and the increase in radiation. So by now we have established that the planet experiences significant amounts of radiation, which is harmful to human life. Now that's all well and good, but we already knew that from gameplay, and from the dosimeter on the back of the spacesuit. On this point, it is actually important to have the dosimeter present, since, unless you get hit with enough radiation to cause heating of the affected area, humans don't have any way of naturally sensing radiation, at least not until the negative physiological effects have begun to manifest. The dosimeter also records the amount of radiation the user is exposed to, which decreases over time, in particular when sleeping in the infirmary. This indicates that the dosimeter is tracking the user's radiation exposure in relation to a maximum recommended safe dosage as a function of time. Effectively, the goal is to avoid significant doses of radiation so that no acute effects will manifest, and you will probably only suffer chronic radiation sickness. However, it would seem that the pharmaceuticals in the infirmary have some means of counteracting the effects of radiation damage to cells. This would then seemingly serve to increase the total safe dosage that a human could handle, since the damage to cells from radiation is offset by the repairs done by the pharmaceuticals. Unfortunately, these pharmaceuticals are still a ways off in current year, and while there does seem to be evidence that antioxidants can be potentially helpful in restoring cell damage, we'd probably need to give these pharmaceuticals another miracle exception. Fortunately for the crew, though, the CEBA Base possesses radiation shielding that seemingly completely eliminates the negative effects of the radiation outside. This is accomplished by means of what is termed in-game radiation filters. Now, the method by which these operate is not immediately obvious, since you can't really filter the radiation out of the air. It's just shooting through it very rapidly. Nowadays, you generally would rely on radiation-absorbing materials to reduce radiation exposure, and or just tank the incoming energetic particles because you can't stop them. But there could perhaps be a more advanced solution in place here. Since much of space radiation consists of dangerous charged particles, then these particles can, in principle, be deflected by an electromagnetic field. So, if you were to establish a sufficiently strong electromagnetic field surrounding the habitable volume of the base, you could conceptually deflect away charged energetic particles that are incoming towards the base, thus keeping the crew from being impacted by those particles. Now, this is still a theoretical approach, since the amount of power required for this would be quite significant, and there would most likely be additional effects on hardware from the electromagnetic field to consider, but this approach would at least be consistent with the currently understood laws of physics. In this case, though, the use of radiation filters is still not totally clear, since if you're able to deflect the path of an incoming particle, why not just send it away from the base instead of absorbing it into the filter? It could perhaps be the case that the shape of the electromagnetic field results in particles being redirected into the filters themselves, perhaps as a result of a cardioid pattern, for example, and the filters then absorb the incoming particles into a chemical compound that is able to absorb them more effectively. If we stick only to existing materials, this could perhaps be water or hydrogen, or hydrocarbon-containing compounds such as paraffin, or, given the fact that we are so far into the future, given all these miracle exceptions we're needing, we could say that there is some highly effective radiation shielding material used in the radiation filters. Even so, given the principle of electromagnetic shielding, if you were able to control the shape of the electromagnetic field and form it into any arbitrary shape, then it would seem like these radiation filters are perhaps an over-engineered solution if you can just deflect the radiation away from the base entirely. So, as we just surmised, perhaps these filters are due to limitations of the electromagnetic shielding technology. Now at this point, we have effectively covered the planetary science topics that are well explained by commonly understood laws of physics. However, there are also quite a lot of strange phenomena that we encounter throughout the altars that will involve a much deeper investigation and appeal to more advanced theories in order to explain. So from here, we can transition away from planetary science topics and move on into theoretical physics. Now, in order for us to discuss the theoretical physics that are behind some of the phenomena we see in the altars, I will have to kind of get into spoilers to some extent. Very light, but eventually this does become relevant to the overall plot of the game. We can discuss most of the physical phenomena without going into heavy spoilers, but be aware that I will have to have some minor spoilers through this section. Now, this section is going to be heavily based in theoretical physics, with an emphasis on theory, and to an extent bleeds over into cosmology. Since in order to explain what's going on here, we will be attempting to understand the nature of reality, at least as it's presented in the altars. Just as a heads up, we are going to be getting into quite a lot of theoretical physics topics in this next section. So to establish the theory which we will be considering, we can start with the description from Yon Scientist.
I found something peculiar on the planet. What exactly was peculiar about it? Everything. It was like a local distortion of reality. And it seemed to be emitting strong radiation. Yes. We could have expected to come across something like that sooner or later, according to reports from previous missions. Unidentified sources of radiation, unexplained electromagnetic field anomalies, distortions of matter, space, or even gravity. What are they? According to a bold theory fleshed out by Professor Frankov, they may be instances of the so-called interval. In very simple terms, it's a non-coincidental superposition of potential universes. We don't know exactly why it occurs, but observations prove that under certain, not yet specified conditions, two or more parallel landscapes can coexist within a common quantum field, creating a so-called proximity plane. If, and I stress if, Professor Frankov's intuition is right, then the distortion you have encountered could have been a puncture point, the spot where the proximity plane intersects with our observed universe, subverting its physical balance and distorting the rules of Newtonian mechanics.
Now that sounds like quite a bit of physics here, but we can boil this down to two primary elements of this theory, those being the interval and proximity plane. We can start by attempting to define the interval, since this is responsible for the presence of the proximity plane. Recalling our discussion on quantum superposition from the quantum computer section of this review, the implication here is that the additive superposition of wave functions leads to the manifestation, for lack of a better term, of matter from one hypergeometrical plane onto another. Now don't worry, we'll break it down in more detail than that, but I just want to get the whole explanation out to start with so that you can kind of fill in the blanks as we go. Perhaps the more important aspect of this solution to be defined is what a wave function is. At a very basic level, this term is derived from particle physics, where, due to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, we're not actually able to say conclusively both where an electron is in its orbit and how fast it's moving. Since in order to find out one of these values, we would have to measure it, but in order to perform that measurement, we would change its orbital trajectory, and thus we wouldn't be able to actually know what its state was beforehand. As a result of this inherent uncertainty, we can't describe atoms as being present in orbits like we saw in the Bohr model of the atom, and rather we have to describe electron positions by probabilities of finding the electron at those positions. The mathematical equation that describes this probability distribution about the atom is known as the wave function. So if we were to generalize this concept, the wave function essentially describes the probability of finding something in a particular state or location at a given point in time. As we briefly discussed with our discussion of qubits, a wave function is said to be in a coherent state while it is describing these probability distributions. Once a measurement has been made, the probability of all states other than the one that has been measured drop to zero, and this is referred to as the collapse of the wave function, since it is no longer describing a probability distribution. We are going to be bringing this up to a very broad level, so if you are more knowledgeable about these equations than I am, please feel free to correct any mathematical errors. Now, since the physics of an atom are largely defined by quantum mechanics, we can be fairly confident in the ability of the wave function to describe how it works. What is still more debated is whether or not a wave function can be applied to other systems that are primarily dominated by classical mechanics. A big example of this would be the famous Schrödinger's cat paradox, which you've probably heard before, so I won't repeat here. This theory of quantum wave functions being applied to classical objects can eventually be scaled up to effectively the largest wave function possible, which would be a wave function defining the state of the entire universe. This would form the basis of a pilot wave theory, and in such theories, the equation for the pilot wave describes the location and motion of every particle within the universe. One of the most prominent pilot wave theories is the Broglie-Bohm theorem. And yes, I'm aware that's not how you pronounce it, but that's how I read it, so I'm just going to keep saying that. Now, we'll come back to this mispronounced theory in a moment, but just keep in mind that this is the premier implementation of the pilot wave theory. To very briefly summarize the principles of non-locality and determinism in quantum mechanics, John Stuart Bell proposed several experiments that could be used to prove whether or not such a pilot wave function exists, or more specifically to determine whether or not hidden variables exist, which is part of a pilot wave function, but not exactly the same thing. Remember, we're glossing over quite a lot here. The key point of most of this is that, to date, the results of Bell tests do not indicate support for the existence of pilot wave theories. This isn't to say that the pilot wave doesn't exist, just that experimental results so far do not support that theory. We're not here to decide the fate of the universe, though, at least not conclusively, and so instead, we will note that this pilot wave theory appears to be what is referenced within the alters. Now, to gradually get us back on track towards Professor Frankov's theories, since the pilot wave is a mathematical function, it could theoretically be exposed to a superposition. Based on what we see within the alters, there are a few different possibilities for how this might occur. The first option, and the one that I personally find most boring, is the many worlds theory, more colloquially known as the multiverse. Within this framework, the superposition of wave functions from multiple parallel universes could result in the manifestation, again for lack of a better term, of objects from one universe into effectively all the superposed wave functions. The most immediate problem with this is the mechanism by which the superposition occurs, which would be challenging if we do not consider the existence of a higher dimensional spacetime in which each of these multiverses is existing. This then essentially puts the multiverse within another space-time, and this process can be repeated infinitely. In addition to this more technical challenge, personally I also find many worlds theory to be rather boring, primarily from a philosophical perspective, but also because if you consider the many worlds to be not interacting, barring any superpositions like we see in the alters, then you effectively have an unfalsifiable and thus unscientific basis for your theory. At some level, I would also say that the many worlds theory sort of comes across as almost lazy, which admittedly is quite subjective. But essentially, this is just because that you don't ever actually have to determine what happens when a wave function collapses. You just assume that everything is happening, and thus, nothing is really happening. I know we're getting a little bit off track here, but I do want to conclude this with one final note, since the multiverse is so popular nowadays. As reported by physicist Michael Nielsen, at a quantum computing conference in 1998, a poll was conducted of audience members for whether or not they thought many worlds theory was accurate. It was quite popular, though just below the mainstream interpretations of quantum mechanics, but the real winner was the physicist who went up to the stage at the end of the poll and was received with applause when he asked the question whether or not people believe that the laws of physics were decided by democratic vote. Alright, I know we kind of went down a rabbit hole with that, so we'll bring it back again to the question of how can quantum superpositions occur within the world of the alters to produce the proximity plane from the integral. Many worlds theory was our first proposal. The second is perhaps the bit more interesting one. Recall that de Broglie-Bohm theory poses a pilot wave that describes the position and motion of every particle within the universe. However, since the pilot wave is a mathematical formulation, which may or may not be objectively real depending on your theory, then it has some interesting mathematical properties as well. The sequence of events that would occur as a result of an action that did not take place are still accurately described by the evolution of the wave function. To tie it back into the world of the alters, we could say that the pilot wave is perfectly capable of describing the paths of particles that occur as a result of Jan's choice to go to college. But in the event that Jan did not choose to go to college, the pilot wave function would still be capable of describing the motions of particles in that timeline. Thus, the evolution of those pilot waves is still capable of describing a complete world. It's just that that branch of the pilot wave doesn't actually possess any particles which it is describing. In effect, if you were to somehow give particles to this pilot wave, it would be able to describe a complete world. However, the real world consists of only a single branch of the pilot wave that is actually occurring. It's just that if you wanted to, you could describe other worlds by this equation. Now, especially in our case of the alters, this theory is actually quite convenient for us in explaining the method of operation of the quantum computer. If through some advanced mechanism the quantum computer is able to deduce enough of the pilot wave function, it can simulate how particles would behave in these other branches by evolving the pilot wave function along those branches. Now, this theory would probably be the most effective at explaining the interroll that we encounter in the alters, were it not for a late game story element that I can't say without spoiling. To keep it as vague as possible, essentially, at some point in the game, we are able to interact with the proximity plane by means of electromagnetic fields and physical contact, which technically are the same thing. In de Broglie-Bohm theory, the alternate branches that could be described by the pilot wave don't actually exist, and so as a result you would not be able to physically interact with them without manipulating the actually physically real pilot wave. I really looked for a way to explain what we see in the game through means of this pilot wave manipulation, but this is specifically mentioned as an interaction that is brought about as a result of electromagnetic fields, and so de Broglie-Bohm theory is not technically able to fully explain everything that we see in the game. The third and final potential explanation for the interroll is arguably the simplest, though that doesn't really mean a whole lot at this level of physics. This theory is at least superficially somewhat similar to many worlds theory, but with some important distinctions. The basis of this theory is that the world exists on a three-dimensional space that is part of a four-dimensional hyperspace that contains additional three-dimensional spaces alongside the one that we are inhabiting. Of course, I'm talking about fourth Euclidean dimension here, not the boring fourth Minkowski dimension. This hyperspace, containing some amount of three-dimensional spaces, can be visualized as a book holding multiple pages on top of each other. It's essentially the same concept, just reduced by one dimension. This whole thing is so much easier to explain if you've read Flatland, so I highly recommend that book. It's a great read and not terribly long either. In effect, what we have then is a four-dimensional universe containing multiple three-dimensional spaces, all of which happen to have various stars, planets, moons, and materials. Now, while we could describe these as parallel dimensions, we're not requiring that they be identical or nearly identical to our own dimension. They are simply another point in space. But it could perhaps be possible, given a sufficient number of alternate or parallel dimensions, that you might end up with the same planet within the same place within two parallel dimensions. And if you were somehow able to reach across dimensions, you might find yourself on what appears to be the same planet, but is actually a different planet within a different dimension, but is extremely similar to the one you started on. Now, within this theory, these other dimensions are physically real, and thus you would technically be able to interact with them if you were somehow able to produce a four-dimensional electromagnetic field. How exactly you would do this is not really addressed in the game, it's just stated that it happens, somehow. But in this case, you're essentially just providing an interaction between two different points in space via an electromagnetic field, which is something that is well understood to be possible within current laws of physics. And so the question then becomes how these different parallel dimensions might overlap with each other and manifest objects from one into another. This is where we could insert our pilot wave theory, and we could suggest that there is something in this planet that causes these pilot waves of these different parallel dimensions to superimpose on each other, resulting in a superposition of states and manifestation of objects from one parallel dimension into another. This does still leave open the question of what is causing this mechanism, and of course we're definitely not going to get out of this discussion without requiring at least one miracle exception, but this does at least cover all our bases to explain what we see in game. In the case of the quantum computer as well, we could still say that it does have access to a pilot wave, which it is able to evaluate and then create branches of in a mathematical sense, which, as we discussed in that section, gives us at least a little bit of simplification to this massive mathematical problem. So, in conclusion of our physics analysis, we have come to the conclusion that the most plausible way to explain the interroll and the proximity plane, as well as the other phenomena that we see in game, is the existence of a hyperspace in which the current dimension exists, along with several additional dimensions that exist within the same four-dimensional space. Each of these dimensions are governed by their own pilot wave, which through some unknown mechanism at this particular planet, experience a superposition of states, resulting in the manifestation of objects from one parallel dimension into the one we inhabit. Now this is all extremely hypothetical, and could probably be torn apart fairly easily if you were to actually go at this with professional knowledge levels of theoretical physics. This is, however, my best attempt at explaining the physics of what we see within the altars, in a way that at least is somewhat rooted in current understandings of the laws of physics. As mentioned at the start of this section though, we are essentially getting into cosmology here, which is that interesting combination realm between physics and philosophy, which also happens to be just about where we're at in the timeline of this video. So if you have a different theory of what happens in game, I would definitely be interested in reading about it in the comments of this video. As a concluding note to our discussion of physics though, and as we start to transition into our discussions of philosophy, I will make the note that it is on some level rather inconsequential which interpretation of quantum mechanics you choose to explain what happens in game, as the events of the game still unfold nonetheless, and you will still have to deal with them regardless of your choice of quantum theory. And so on that note, we can tip the balance of our cosmological discussions towards the realm of philosophy. Since The Altars is an excellent work of philosophical science fiction, and so far we have discussed the science fiction aspects of the game in great detail, it seems only fair that we take some time to discuss some of the philosophical topics of the game as well. Now before beginning this final section of the video, I do once again highly recommend that you play this game on your own first, and use it as an opportunity to test your own philosophy in the situations that occur in the game. Without giving away too much detail, this is not a game in which there is a simple and clear good versus evil approach that you can take. Rather, there are a lot of nuanced and tough decisions that you'll have to make as the captain of this crew, which makes it an excellent opportunity to put your own philosophy to the test. Of course, in order to discuss the philosophy of the game, I will have to present my own philosophy, thus I would recommend that you play the game first, so that you first are able to experience it with your own perspective. I also want to make it clear here that what I am presenting at this point is my own beliefs and philosophy, and I am not trying to say that what I am saying is the only correct way to think, or that I know everything about what's going on here. These are very complex and important questions, and it is my personal opinion that it should be the responsibility of everyone to make up their own mind on these topics individually. That being said, since this is my own philosophy that I'm presenting, it is necessarily then what I believe to be true. But just because you hear this from me, some random guy on the internet, doesn't mean that you should necessarily believe it automatically. So hopefully that covers all our bases and paints a picture of where I'm trying to come from with this.
I'm just giving you a tool. You decide how to use it.
So with that said, I will give you one last opportunity to pause the video and go play the game yourself before we begin our philosophical treatment of the altars. A majority of the philosophical decisions to be made in the altars eventually reduce down to the question of the nature of the alterated clones. Further defining this question, we might ask, are their memories real or valid? Are they independent people or just different versions of Jan Dolsky, with rewired neurochemistry to make them believe they've lived different lives? And perhaps, are these clones even really alive on the same level as a natural person? Now, obviously, a very robust philosophical framework is necessary to attack these questions. However, I have identified two sources that should, to some level, be sufficient to provide us with a perspective with which we can approach these questions. The first source is a record of experiential hallucinations experienced by patients during awake craniotomies under Dr. Wilder Penfield, a Canadian brain surgeon who had an extensive record of treating seizures via open brain surgery. Fair warning, this part might be a little nausea-inducing if you're queasy. Since the sensations of touch and pain come about as a result of stimulation of nerves, then if you were to touch a part of the body that does not have these sensory neurons, you wouldn't be able to feel it. And as it turns out, the brain itself doesn't actually have neurons that can sense touch. So it is thus possible to have brain surgery while the brain is exposed through an opening in the skull while you are still conscious. Now, of course, you still have to be anesthetized to actually access the brain, but during the surgery, you can be completely awake, and in fact, this is essential for certain types of operations. In Dr. Penfield's operations, these awake craniotomies were performed on patients who had previously suffered from seizures. In many cases, the patients would experience a particular sensation which would signal the onset of the seizure. This would then indicate that the part of the brain responsible for that sensation would at least be in part responsible for the initiation of the seizure. So in order to locate the appropriate locations in the brain that were responsible for initiating these seizures, Dr. Penfield would stimulate different parts of the brain using electrodes, and then could determine from the patient's response when he had located the correct area. Now, this was done during the time where the exact mapping of the brain was not completely understood, and whether it is nowadays is another discussion. And in fact, a lot of this brain mapping was pioneered by Dr. Penfield. Now, in addition to mapping different parts of the brain to different parts of the body and different sorts of sensations, there was a curious phenomenon that Dr. Penfield discovered in a small number of his patients. In about 10% of patients, it was discovered that by applying an electrode to a particular part of the brain, the patient would experience memories as though they were happening again in the present. These were often fleeting fragments of memories, but oftentimes they were also quite concrete, and in some cases quite detailed. One common manifestation of these recurring memories was hearing music, which in some cases the song could be identified by people in the operating room once it was hummed by the patient. Hearing familiar voices was also a relatively common occurrence of the patients in which this phenomenon was identified. In some cases, patients also experienced visual hallucinations, sometimes including whole scenes that they found themselves in. Now, perhaps the most immediate conclusion to this is that the brain does seem to store memories in particular locations, which is something that we had considered when discussing the operations of the womb module. However, the key feature of interest in these discoveries was that, according to Dr. Penfield, except for occasional moments of confusion, all of the patients remained aware that they were having an operation even during these vivid hallucinations. Now, from this, the point may seem to present itself as something rather simple, but it is worth putting in definite words for the purposes of our discussion. In the cases in which patients experienced hallucinations that would seemingly be the result of sensory input, they were still aware that what they were experiencing was not in fact reality. In the case of voices, they did at some points mistake them for people in the operating room, but upon being told that this was not the case, they were able to identify that these were hallucinations. This then leads us to our final conclusion from the records of Dr. Penfield. There is some way in which the self is able to identify that the sensory perceptions that it is receiving are in fact separate from reality. But if we were to consider this as a purely electromechanical system, as far as the brain itself is concerned, the neurochemical processes taking place within the brain during these stimulations are the same as if those experiences were actually taking place. In other words, as far as the brain is concerned, the person is actually experiencing these things. So, from the fact that the patients were able to correctly identify that what they were experiencing were hallucinations and not reality, we can infer that in some way, the self that is experiencing these things is separate from the brain in which the experience is taking place. Now, at this point, since we are no longer considering that the self is fully contained within the brain, we are effectively ascribing to the self some level of supernaturality. And thus, by definition, we have reached the point at which the field of brain surgery is no longer adequate to fully describe what we are discussing. At this point then, we will move on to the second source I have selected for this section, which is the book Miracles by C.S. Lewis, who was, among other things, a writer, scholar, and contemporary of J.R.R. Tolkien. The primary thesis of this book, as evidenced by its title, is whether or not it is logically or philosophically consistent to suppose that miracles can ever happen. And since most of my reviews are predicated on the concept of a miracle exception to the laws of physics, in context, this could be a pretty important question. It is a highly intellectual book with topics ranging from physics to cosmology to philosophy and then all the way to theology. So I'm definitely not going to be able to summarize it briefly here, and instead I will highly recommend that you read it for yourself. For here and now, though, there is one particular point which Lewis makes within the book that is especially applicable to our current philosophical treatment of the altars. This point is the assertion that a person consists of both a natural organism and a supernatural spirit, which are in some way in symbiosis with each other. Due to their current condition, which we could perhaps describe as entropic if we wanted to be a bit more scientific about it, the natural and supernatural halves of a person are in conflict with each other, which in its current state eventually, inevitably, results in the natural half succeeding in its conflict with the supernatural, leading to physiological death of the natural organism. I suppose I should also make it clear at this point that we are only considering the condition of humans and not any other sorts of organisms or beings. Lewis also makes the surprising logical argument, surprising in the sense of its effectiveness and not necessarily its results, that the current state of this supernatural and natural symbiosis has not always been the case for humankind, which is evidenced by two peculiarities about humans. Those being, and this is the surprising bit, that people make coarse jokes and that the presence of a dead body is unnerving. The argument being that any purely natural or supernatural organism would not find humor in the fact that it exists in its current state. On the second point, Lewis argues that the reasoning for unpleasant feelings regarding the presence of death is that it represents a division between the natural and supernatural halves of a person, which is, in some sense of the word, unnatural. Now, all of this is part of a much larger discussion that takes place in the book, the entirety of which is not directly applicable to our current analysis. So if any of this is interesting, I will once again highly recommend that you read the book for yourself. What we can take away as a conclusion from these excerpts of the argument is that there exists some level of symbiosis between the natural organism and the supernatural spirit that make up a human. This point could probably be rephrased depending on the perspective you want to take with it, but as stated here, this is actually going to be quite important to our philosophical analysis of the altars. And so at this point we have established the two key elements of our perspective with which we will be conducting our philosophical analysis of the nature of the alterated clones. As a brief summary and restatement, from Dr. Penfield we argue that the brain is the seat of consciousness for the supernatural component of a person, which at this point we can refer to as the soul for the sake of simplicity, and to actually put a name to it. From Lewis, we argue that the physical body and the supernatural soul are in symbiosis with each other, and only together will they represent the entirety of a person. Thus establishes our perspective, and now our argument. When we really boil it down, the question that we're trying to answer is effectively, are the altars distinct, unique individuals? On a purely physical basis, they all share the same DNA as Jan Dolsky, and aside from some differences in facial hair and head hair, and possibly musculoskeletal structures, the only difference between them is the wiring of their brains. This would at first seem to imply that the natural component of each individual is the same. Now we can tackle this in a moment, but first it is worth pointing out that this does not necessarily hold true when considering the soul of each altar. And if the natural process is any indication, the generation of the altars via the womb module results in the existence of a new human organism that is presumably capable of acting as a seat of consciousness for a supernatural self, or in effect, harboring a soul. Of course, using purely physical approaches, there's no way to know this for sure, but again, assuming that the generative process of the formation of the altar is similar to the natural process, we may take the end result as the same in either case. If then the creation of a new physical form involves the creation, or at least inhabitation, of a supernatural self, we could then argue that each altar also possesses a supernatural self, or soul, just as much as any naturally generated person might. That sounds really weird when I word it like that, but I'm going to keep it for the sake of consistency. Now, if we do then say that it is possible for each altar to possess its own soul, we still have the challenge of their physical forms being nearly identical, perhaps even more so than identical twins, depending on the method of manufacturing by the womb module. And at this point, all we can say for certain that is different between the altars is their neurological architecture, as well as their hair, which could technically be taken as evidence of epigenetics, but that's beside the point right now. In this case, our argument could be that the life of the soul in the body involves the generation of memories as a part, or perhaps even a focus, of life. As such, then, the quantum computer is essentially providing a life experience to the soul of the altar as a result of wiring neurons accordingly. Despite the physical body that the soul is inhabiting having a biological age of 35 years, the soul is essentially given the experience of those years. This may seem inherently unnatural, but the end result is still effectively identical to the life experience of a naturally born human with 35 years of experience that they've lived through. That is to say, at any given moment, either person could just as easily recall a particular moment from their past. And thus, in terms of memory at least, the memories that the altars have of their lives is just as real to them as Jan Dolsky's memories of his own life are to him. And with different life experiences, we would have no reason to expect that both persons should be identical. In summary then, what we have with each altar is a natural organism that is presumably harboring a soul, though we have no physical way of knowing for sure, and that symbiotic relationship between the supernatural soul and the physical organism consists of a unique person with their own life experiences, which is at least partially the cause of their uniqueness. Or to boil it down as far as possible, there is a new body with a new soul and thus a new life.
You're right. We are different.
Sure we are. Like, I got that right away, and you took your sweet time.
And, okay, while we might have been overly thorough in our analysis, this process of logical reasoning allows us to build a strong basis for our argument, and after all, I am an engineer. That's just how I roll. However, the stability which we have provided to our conclusions allows it to act as a foundation upon which we can build other arguments. Perhaps the most important extension to these arguments could be the fact that, aside from the implantation of memories by the womb module, the rest of our philosophical analysis is not necessarily only specific to clones. We've just made an argument that the life experiences of the alters is just as valid as any of us, but this also inherently means that our own life experiences are valid as well. They are certainly very different from each other, in some cases more so than others, and some experiences are generally perceived as qualitatively being easier or harder than others. But all the challenges in one's life, as well as their successes, contribute to the uniqueness of that life, and this uniqueness to a great extent contributes to the validity and value of that life. Not even identical twins have the same life experiences, and the uniqueness of your own life experience means that there is none like it in the entire history of humanity, making it, mathematically, a statistical miracle and philosophically infinitely valuable. As a final conclusion to this video, we can revisit our original question of whether or not the alters can be considered to be realistic. If we review the list of miracle exceptions that we've encountered throughout the game, then by our strict definition of adhering to the laws of physics as currently understood, then the alters would be the least realistic game that we've reviewed on this channel so far. However, it's also probably fair to say that the alters is much more aptly described as a philosophical science fiction work, more so than hard sci-fi. And so the questions brought about by the presence of the technology in the game are perhaps more important than the actual explanation of those mechanics. And on the plus side, aside from a late game development that complicates our implementation of Bohmian mechanics, the story adheres to the constraints set by the available technology that we have in this world. And while we didn't really talk about it very much throughout the course of our engineering-focused review, the very realistic manner in which each of the alters is portrayed as their own person, with their own characteristic and unique personality, is perhaps a more valuable contribution to the overall experience of the game, more so than having an accurate description of an Alcubierre warp drive. The same could also probably be said for the big questions that the game dares to ask, which often don't come up to this extent in other science fiction media. So for our final verdict, in answer to the question, is the alters realistic? Strictly speaking, no, but it also really doesn't need to be. Instead, here we have a game that, rather than being interrogated for its scientific accuracy, asks you, the player, more important questions, and this asking is in itself more important than a properly rendered science fiction setting. And so, on this rather fittingly philosophical note, we've reached the point of the video where I say, thank you very much for watching. If you somehow got here without having played the game first, I hope by now I've finally convinced you that this game is definitely worth playing yourself. Alternatively, if you played this game before watching and had a very different experience from me, I would also be curious to hear about that in the comments. Also, as mentioned throughout the video, if anything I said didn't make sense, or you understand better than I do, or if you have a different take on the philosophical discussion that we had, or if you have any other thoughts to share,
You have a talent for making extraordinary things sound mundane.
I would definitely be interested in reading them as well. Either way, the fact that you're listening to this now is really cool to me, and I'm very grateful that so many people have found these videos interesting, or at the very least, something that can help you fall asleep at night. As I always say at the end of these videos, I am interested in doing more of them, but considering how much effort they take, I probably will need a bit of a break first. As seems to be usually the case, I do have some other shorter projects that I will hopefully be able to complete in a much more reasonable amount of time. So if you'd like to see what all that's about, and or be notified the next time I have a big sci-fi review up and ready to go, you're more than welcome to subscribe to the channel to be notified when I have something else to share. But until then, once again, thank you very much for watching.
You're not gonna leave me alone, are you? Nope. We're in this together. Fine. Give me the shortest part.
Growing up apart, we shared surprisingly common ground, feeling nothing more than regret. Till the coin got flipped around.
Things never said. In quantum state.
now won't remain unspoken. The clock is unwound, the choice is unsound, could now reopen. What if I gotta spend a day with you again? Of all the things that I regret, it's losing you that truly hurts. If I could take another turn, my life would never be the same. If I could get another chance today. On the path I left behind, I made choices that were not always right, but I'm no longer left all by myself. We've got a common goal in sight, and though it seems now anything could be undone, would you be really missing things if they were never truly gone? If I could take another